Hey guys, Hamato Asami here with another reading for you. This time it's The Life and Times of Rosemary Black by Leo Van 221, and I've had a request from a friend of mine to read the scene that takes place in the Shrieking Shack. So, okay. Harry, Hermione, Rose, run! Ron roared, pointing in terror toward something behind me. In sync, the three of us slowly turned, my two friends in horror, but I was spinning with hope filling my veins. Sure enough, there was the large, almost bear-like, black, scruffy dog, growling in our general direction. Dad. Even though I've seen him a few times, albeit briefly, I still wanted to sob and hug my father, but I couldn't just yet. Not until these three know the truth. They still think I'm Lupin's biological daughter. Reluctantly, I managed to look at least extremely surprised as the dog leapt over me. It launched itself at Ron impatiently. Ron was horrified and screaming for us as my dad dragged him into the Whomping Willow. Ron's foot caught on the entrance to a tunnel Remus had told me about, and there was a loud crack, as it broke, and Ron was tugged into the passageway. Help me! Echoed across the still night air as I dove into the tunnel, not just to rescue Ron. Dad won't hurt Ron any more than necessary, I hope. I just can't help but think about how scared Ron must be, being dragged along by what he's sure is the Grim. Poor bloke. He'll understand soon enough, though, I think. Before I knew it, we were in the Shrieking Shack, Ron trying to reach me past Dad's huge dog body. I paused my headlong sprint for a split second as I thought of every time Remus must have hurried along right where I am, about to transform into a dangerous beast, to scratch, claw, and bite himself because he couldn't hurt anyone else. And then came the Marauders, and Remus was then accompanied by his dearest friends, only held in check by Dad, James, and my own mother. It must have been terrible, awful for Remus. Speaking of my godfather, I wonder if he saw us heading to Hagrid's and back again, somehow, on the map. If he can see us now, heading into the very place Remus would never want to come back to, especially given what night of the month it is. Remus wouldn't come back to the shack he'd mutilated himself in ever again. I can't blame him, and I certainly don't want him to come. I've heard this story often enough to tell it myself, though there are several loopholes, but I think I can get Dad to explain it before he does whatever he's trying to do. Oh, wait a minute. Ron, Harry, and Hermione still think Dad's a... Oh, Merlin's beard, this will be interesting. I'm now helping a nearly sobbing Ron up the stairs, trying to keep Dad off him as he repeatedly lunged for Ron's robes. After the third time, I regrettably kicked him away. He hit the floor and shook his head, hardly dazed, as I got Ron all the way up the stairs and into a spare bedroom. By the time Dad caught up, we heard Harry and Hermione entering downstairs, trying to be stealthy as they crept nearer. I pushed Ron onto the bed gently, and suddenly Ron's wand was in between my shoulder blades. Now, you're to stay right there, all right? Came Dad's horribly raspy voice. I turned, Dad gently shoving me around, and got a good look at him as the others came near to the room. He was staring right back at me. It's hard to describe Dad. He looks so much haggard and worse for the wear, compared to the laughing, carefree man in Remus's photos. I swallow. He looks terrible. What happened in Azkaban? What did that place do to him? His eyes look shrunken and bright at the same time. He looks thin and very skeletal. His eyes have an odd fire to them that immediately sets me on edge, even if it is my own father. And then he's gone, slinking back into the shadows by the door. Ron, are you okay? Where's the dog? Harry demanded, hurrying into the room. Right, they're still here. Harry, don't! It's a trap! He's a dog! He's an animagus! Ron cried, pointing with the utmost fear to a point behind the three of us still capable of standing. We turn and follow a trail of huge footprints, paw prints, which morph into footprints by the corner behind the door. That's where Dad went. I'm pretty sure that the others think much worse of my dad than I do as they entered the room, but that's just because they don't see things clearly yet. They read the prophet's stinking false report on the subject and believed it. Their eyes were filled with fear as Dad closed the door with a loud snap. There was silence for a few seconds before... Expelliarmus! Dad croaked, catching the two wands, Harry and Hermione's, that had been pointing at him, his voice raspy, as though he was quite out of the habit of using it. Hermione looked ready to pass out, but she stepped in front of Harry protectively. I knew Harry wasn't the target, but I had to keep up the pretense of fearing my dad, so I took up a stance beside Hermione, and quickly hauled Ron up as he reached for my hand, and he caught himself on Harry's shoulder, slipped a little, but caught Harry's arm. Dad took no notice of this, and fixed his gaze solely on Harry and I, scrutinizing us, I feel certain. I briefly thought his eyes menacing, but then realized that Dad was merely drinking in the sight of Harry and me after 12 years of rotting in Azkaban for nothing. His eyes then roved over my scars, and they turned slightly sad and a bit angry, like he wanted to beat up whoever had given them to me. I prayed he wouldn't, as he looked almost murderous, which really wasn't helping his own case. "I thought you'd come and help your friend, you two," he said with a small grin. His voice was still quite hoarse. "Your father would have done the same for me, Harry. Your mother, too, Rosemary. Brave of you all, not to run for a teacher. I'm grateful. It'll make things so much easier." Harry looked ready to explode with rage. Of course he would. He thinks Dad betrayed his two best mates in the world to Voldemort. Remus says his name, so do I. Harry made to move forward, but Hermione and I pulled him back. Ron fell back under the bed. "No, Harry!" we spoke in unison, although Hermione sounded petrified. I, however, was a bit more insistent. I couldn't have Harry trying to kill my dad. And then I'd have to intervene and probably answer some awkward questions. Ron then stood again, the blood immediately leaving his face. He was in quite a bit of pain, it was obvious. "If you want to kill Harry, you'll have to kill us too," Ron and Hermione said together, but I knew Dad wouldn't. Ron's face was bloodless and tight with pain, but his eyes shone with determination as he clung to Harry's arm for support. Dad's eyes flashed with something like amusement, and he smirked. "Lie down. You'll damage that leg even more." There was definitely amusement in his voice now. Ron's face screwed up in confusion. "Didn't you hear me?" he asked weakly, blinking rapidly. "You'll have to kill all 4 of us, too." Dad grimaced. It could have also been a menacing glare, I suppose. "No, there'll only be one murder here tonight." Harry's eyes flashed violently, and his fists clenched at his side. He was trembling with rage. "Why's that?" he growled. "Didn't care last time, did you? Didn't mind slaughtering all those muggles to get at Pettigrew, did you?" Dad's eyes flashed with both anger and sorrow, grief and rage for an instant, and he opened his mouth. "What's the matter? Gone soft in Azkaban?" Harry jabbed when he saw he had a reaction. That remark was taking things too far. I squeezed Harry's shoulders to silence him, even as Hermione did the same fearfully beside me. "Harry, quiet," she whispered. Harry looked even angrier than before. He whipped his head around to glare at Hermione. "He killed my mom and dad!" Harry yelled, apparently taking enough and wrenching free of our hold. He didn't seem to even be aware of what he was doing in his rage, tackling Dad and simultaneously holding the wands Dad clutched at bay and punching every part of my father within reach of his fist. "Harry, no!" I cried and leapt forward, but Hermione was in my way. "What are you doing?" she yelled nervously. "Are you helping Black?" she demanded harshly. I couldn't answer, setting my jaw in determination, ripping my arm away. Hermione was yelling at us all to stop fighting, even as Ron joined the struggle. It was all a chaotic mess. It was yelling, limbs, and confusion. I didn't register what I was doing or who I was hitting. I was just trying to make sure it wasn't my father, who was struggling to keep a firm, but not too tight grip on Harry's throat. Dad seemed to be merely trying to restrain Harry, to prevent him doing anything regrettable before he explained himself. "No," he was saying, and with his raspy voice it sounded quite like a hiss. "I've waited too long." "Harry, enough!" I yelled, but Harry didn't even seem to hear me. I couldn't see anything after that, as Hermione sent her foot crashing into my skull as I dived for Harry. I stumbled back, white lights dancing in front of my eyes, pain throbbing fiercely at the base of my skull. "Ouch!" I roared, rubbing my head. Hermione looked horrified. "Sorry, I was aiming for—" I growled. "Never mind that now. Get Harry off him, or Black'll kill him," I spat, still smarting from Hermione's kick. She looked confused, but I was already pulling Ron off. He hardly resisted, face taking a slightly green color, growling in pain. Harry seemed to be retrieving his wand from the floor, but Crookshanks intervened. However, Harry got his wand anyway. He was now pointing it at Dad, who was looking much worse for the wear than Harry for the previous tussle. He was collapsed against the bottom of the wall, panting and oozing blood in a few different places. My breath caught at the fire in Harry's eyes, and I hardly heard his warning to back away due to the pounding in my ears. Much as I wanted to defend my father, I need them to not hate my dad before I do that. It'll make things a lot easier. These three are the closest friends I've ever had. Remus and I had been moving around too much before this for me to have any real friends. I didn't want to lose these ones. However, Harry looked positively murderous, so I reluctantly backed a few steps away. Ron collapsed back on the bed, panting and looking a little green around the edges. Hermione now had a bleeding lip I may or may not have given her. I can't remember now. Dad was panting heavily as Harry walked slowly toward him, his wand pointing directly at Dad, whose eyes seemed sad. "Going to kill me, Harry?" he asked, his voice soft. I prayed Harry wouldn't. "You killed my parents," Harry replied, his voice breaking slightly. I gulped. Harry really wanted to kill Dad, but I don't believe he actually will. Right? Well, not if I have anything to say about... "I don't deny it," Dad said very softly, his voice barely audible. I blinked, tears brimming and heart thudding. What was Dad talking about? He wasn't the spy. No. I refused to believe it. No. But if you knew the whole story... Okay. That might mean Dad's still innocent. "The whole story?" Harry repeated incredulously. "You sold them to Voldemort. That's all I need to know." Dad flinched, and there was that sadness in his eyes again. He took a deep breath. "You've got to listen to me," he said, and it could be my imagination. But was Dad sending me a pleading look as well as Harry? Either way, there was a rapidly growing note of urgency in Dad's voice. "You'll regret it if you don't. You don't understand." I was eager for him to tell me the story. Remus hadn't exactly been free with details when I was younger, even after I learned the hard way why the Marauders formed. He had merely told me to drop it, that I would learn when I was older. Older never came. "I understand a lot better than you think," Harry spat, still refusing to lower his wand. "You never heard her, did you? My mom, trying to stop Voldemort killing me? And you did that. You did it." Harry's voice was now shaking, and suddenly a streak of furry ginger came leaping onto Dad's chest. I nearly smirked. Good old Crookshanks. Harry's murderous gaze, however, did not decrease. "Harry," I growled. "Think about this," I pleaded. Harry didn't seem to hear me. "Please, you can't murder him. It's not like you. Please." He wouldn't actually kill both my dad and Crookshanks, would he? It certainly seemed so. The seconds dragged on, though, and still Harry had made no move. The sound of muffled footsteps downstairs startled us all. Hermione looked faint with relief. "We're up here!" she screamed. "We're up here! Sirius Black! Quick!" "Stop it! We don't know who's down there," I hissed, glaring at Hermione. She gazed back at me like I was insane. But I was right. We didn't know who was down there, and I was not going to give up what may be my only chance to hear Dad's side of the story. And suddenly, before any of us knew what was happening, there was a shower of sparks from the doors that flew open. Pfft. Everybody froze as none other than Remus Lupin came charging into the room. He took in the situation at a glance, me in position by the bed to tackle Harry, who hadn't lowered his wand from Dad's heart as he lay crumpled and a little bloody at Harry's feet, with Ron in the background, whimpering softly in pain, and Hermione cowering by the door, and then flicked his wand at Harry. "Expelliarmus!" he cried, and Harry's wand, as well as the two Hermione still clutched in her hand, and mine, flew toward Remus, and he caught them deftly. Remus motioned for me to come, and I reluctantly did. "Well, well, well, Sirius," Remus said without emotion, staring blankly down at Dad as he kept one arm protectively outstretched in front of me. Dad's eyes flickered strangely as he took in both me and Remus in the same space. His grin grew immensely. He quite looked as though Christmas had come early. "Looking rather ragged, aren't we?" Remus stared expressionless down at his friend on the floor. "Finally, the flesh reflects the madness within." I shoot Remus an incredulous stare before remembering that Remus all but thought Dad responsible for those muggles. for murdering all those muggles. Mainly, I guess Remus didn't know what to think, wanting to stand firm by his friends, but unsure how to respond to the extensive amount of evidence towards Dad's guilt. His solution was to simply refuse to talk about it, but I knew that Remus wanted the answers as much as anyone else did. I then huffed and rolled my eyes. Unperturbed, Dad grinned even wider. "Well, you know all about the madness within, wouldn't you, Remus?" There was a tense silence in the room, me waiting to see if Remus would do, what Remus would do, the others wanting to know what was happening. Remus lowered his wand slightly, looking both amused and incredulous, like he was about to say, "Really?" and roll his eyes. I smirked. Dad's still as sassy and sarcastic as back in his school days, from what little Remus has told me about him. Remus then huffed, with a ring of amusement to it, before asking in a tense voice, "Where is he, Sirius?" in his sudden tense voice as he did. Dad seemed greatly cheered by this question. He was suddenly giggling, and looking rather maniacal. Sounded the part, too. It was terrible. Actually seeing with my own eyes what Azkaban does to people. It was just terrible. "I found him! He's here! He's here!" Dad was shaking Remus slightly with one hand, pointing at Ron. "Me? He's mental, he is!" with the other. "She's here, too," Dad continued, now pointing an overly excited finger at me. "This is perfect! She can help us! She can help us finally kill him!" I only heard that last bit, the part concerning me, because of my sharpened hearing, and was slightly taken aback. Was Dad talking about me? Asking me to help him and Remus kill someone? Not Harry, surely. So, who? Not Ron. But there's no one else here. No males, I mean. Dad clearly said, "He's here," which means that whomever Dad and Remus's target is, he's here. But who is it? Wait. Peter! Of course! Peter turns into a rat! Stupid, stupid, stupid Rosemary! Peter was an animagus as well! Okay, it all makes sense now. Sorry about that. I was getting panicky. Remus, however, seemed to ignore Dad's enthusiastic mentioning of my assistance and was now eyeing Ron, or, more likely, the rat struggling harder than ever in Ron's hands. He then turned and seemed to be staring, transfixed at something no one else can see behind Dad's shoulder. If you know Remus like I do, you'd know he just had a huge epiphany. If not, you could just assume that Remus was trying to read Dad's mind. He stole another subtle glance at the struggling rat, as he seemed to be working something out in his head. Then he suddenly seemed to regain the power of speech. But then, why hasn't he revealed himself before now? Unless, another epiphany look. Unless he was the one. Unless you switched. Without telling me. What's Remus? Oh, wait. The Secret Keeper! Of course! Remus mentioned Dad being the Secret Keeper as part of the evidence for Dad's guilt. Part of the equation that Remus couldn't believe. Very slowly, almost reverently, Dad nodded. I smiled, feeling more of the puzzle pieces falling into place. Peter as the Secret Keeper, the Potter's deaths, it all clicked now. Dad had never meant to kill Harry or even hurt him. Of course not. Dad's his godfather. He wanted to protect Harry from Pettigrew, who he knew was a loyal servant of Lord Voldemort. Duh! Why do I always forget important things when I get stressed? Apparently, Remus now had enough proof to not feel the slightest amount of guilt in reaching down and pulling Dad up, chuckling as he at last embraced Dad like the brother I knew the pair viewed each other as. Hermione herself got an epiphany look. My stomach lurched. That could not be good. "I don't believe it!" she screeched. Harry looked dazed as though someone had hit him. I sighed. It was bound to happen. In fact, I've been waiting for this ever since I set foot inside the shack. If I were really being honest with myself, deep down, I always knew Remus would come after us, no matter how many horrid, disturbing memories he has in here. Ron was apparently the only one who had heard the sigh and was gazing at me blankly. I shrugged in what I hoped was a confused way. He looked unconvinced, but then Hermione saved me from the situation by spluttering still more angrily. You! She didn't seem to be able to express herself. "Hermione," Lupin said soothingly. Hermione, however, was not to be stopped. "You and him!" "That's enough, Hermione," I said bracingly in a would-be calm manner. Lupin tried again to stall her wrath, but with no more success than last time. The witch was glaring hotly at us. Hermione, calm down. There was something like a wild fear in the young woman's eyes as she glared at Remus and I. I was then struck with a horrible thought. Did Hermione know about Remus? I mean, there was that one time she asked me very suspiciously about the full moons. But had she seen him somehow? No, I put up charms against intruders. I didn't tell anyone, she continued. The gnawing worry grew worse and worse. Hermione, stop! I barked, all sense of calm forgotten. If Hermione did know, Marilyn, this could be very bad. Remus would be back to square one, so to speak, in terms of employment. The girl was not to be calmed, however, and it was with a growing fear and a rage that she continued yelling at the top of her lungs. I've been covering up for you! Hermione, listen to me, please, Remus begged. As soon as Hermione started ranting, I had moved back a little, to spare my hearing and give Remus moral support, should it be revealed that Hermione did, in fact, know about Remus's lycanthropy. Dad's hand reached out and placed itself on my shoulder blade, hidden from view behind Remus, who now looked a bit pale and worried. I gave Dad a subtle smirk and a glance before reaching for Remus and giving his shoulder an affectionate squeeze. But if Remus had even noticed, he gave no indication. I can explain, he pressed, and there was a desperate plea to his voice that I'm sure it went over the others' heads. And all this time, you've been his friend! That remark cut Remus like a knife, I know. That note of hurt, betrayal, and outright fear in Hermione's voice. One of his favorite students. What made it worse was that her expression was mirrored by everyone else. Remus was now living out his personal greatest fear. Rejection by people he thought actually cared for him. Even so, he kept a perfectly straight and calm face, even though Hermione seemed ready to drop the bomb at any second. Harry looked murderous again. However, before Harry could start up his own rant, Remus spoke up. You're wrong, he said quietly, in a tone I knew meant remorse. I haven't been Black's friend, but I am now, he said, offering a tentative smile that faded almost immediately. Let me explain, he started, but never quite finished the sentence, for Hermione had given off a sob and cut Remus off, a desperate, urgent tinge to her voice. No, she wailed. Harry, don't trust them. There's no reason not to, I objected hotly, not really registering the restraining hand on my shoulder. Hermione acted as though she hadn't heard me. They've been helping Buck get into the castle. No, we haven't. I've been with him the whole time. Halloween night, he was at the staff table. You yourself saw him, Hermione. Besides, how could he have... They want you dead, too! Beside me, the hand tightened, though who it was restraining now wasn't clear. I stole a quick glance and saw livid, sunken eyes, glittering angrily not half a foot away from my face. No, he doesn't! We don't! I roared. But then, as if she had been leading up to this point, steeling herself for something terrible she was forcing herself to do, Hermione threw her last proverbial card on the table. He's a werewolf! That's why he's been missing classes, and probably why Rosemary's always tired. She's probably one too, if I had to guess, Hermione cried. I gasped, horror and shock numbing me. It was as though thunder had struck the room. Silence pressed down on all of us, heavy, tense, and oppressive. I goggled, absolutely horrified. Not at Remus, I already knew about his little furry problem, but at the young witch before me. It was as though I was looking at her for the first time as cold fury swept over me. I felt raw and numb in the wake of Hermione's statement. Never in my life would I have guessed that Hermione would use something that has literally ruined Remus in my life to convince someone else that Remus, of all people, is dangerous, and then to throw me in there as well? It numbed me. I thought she was better than this, throwing those kind of accusations around with blatant disregard for the effect of her words. Unbelievable. How dare you! I screeched, wanting to strangle Hermione, though I was rooted to the spot with horror and slight revulsion. I can't believe... How could you... I never would have... I spluttered, so angry I couldn't find the right words. Enough, Rosemary, Remus said in a forced calm, icy tone. My jaw snapped shut audibly. I thought of 1,000 words, none of them polite enough to repeat, mind you, to describe the loathing I felt toward Hermione at that moment. Remus then turned to Hermione. Well, 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 Hermione. You really are the brightest witch of your age, Remus almost spat coolly. However, you're not at all up to your usual standard, I'm afraid. Only 1 out of 3, he said. I smirked, glad Remus wasn't above sassy comebacks. I would join in, but I think Remus put a silencing charm on me. I can't seem to get words out right now. Dad's hand touches my shoulder again, and he grins almost maniacally at me. He's enjoying this, but there's an impatient gleam to his eye. Neither Rosemary nor I have been helping Sirius get into the castle, and we certainly don't want Harry dead, Remus said smoothly, with a hint of waspish venom. There was an odd shudder up Remus's back just then, a shadow flickering across his face ominously. I tensed slightly, suddenly remembering the date. There had been the tiniest hint of the wolf on Remus's face just then. But I won't deny that I am a werewolf. And there it is. The truth is out at last. I pinched the bridge of my nose, reaching out subconsciously with my other hand to touch Remus, try to boost him up a little. I know how down he gets when people are especially nasty to him. Dad was getting twitchy, his hands joining to twiddle and fiddle around, the fingers twisting and untwisting around each other convulsively. Then they dropped to his side and he began to pace. Ron, apparently having taken enough of this conversation, made an effort to stand. Remus and I automatically hurried forward, identical concerned expressions obvious. I reached the bed first and was prepared to slide my arm under Ron's shoulder when he flinched away from us. "Get away from me! Werewolves!" he cried. "Oh, for Merlin's sake!" I smacked him upside the head, forgetting all about his condition in my fury and outrage. "First, don't use the W word," I growled. "Secondly, I am not a werewolf. And third, we're trying to save your sorry butt in case you haven't noticed." I spat low, standing again to place a comforting hand on Remus's shoulder. Remus, however pale and shaken he was, shook me off with a huge effort and turned to Hermione, who now looked almost regretful. She seemed to have finally started to realize just how much damage she'd done. "Good," I sneered. "She needs a wake-up call to the plight of the werewolves, instead of that stupid spew thing." "How long have you known?" Remus asked quietly, his voice getting thicker with each word. "Ages," Hermione gasped. "Since I did Professor Snape's essay," she added. I fumed. "So that's why you asked me about the moon cycles, you twit! You knew I'd know!" I seethed, fists clenching and unclenching with the effort of holding myself back. Hermione drew back slightly, reeling after the tone of my voice. "Good." "Yes," she said. "I was almost finished with it, and... well, I'd already worked out the symptoms. I was just seeing..." She trailed off. "Well, Snape will be delighted," Remus shot, waspish and icy. "He signed that essay hoping someone would work out what my symptoms meant." He gave a mirthless little chuckle. "Did you check the cycles with Rosemary?" he asked, and I felt a huge wave of regret, anger at Hermione, and hurt fled me. I'd realized that I was always ill, Rosemary always extra tired at the full moon. Or did you figure out that the boggart changed into the moon when it saw me? I was hoping nobody had remembered. Apparently so had Remus. He had shattered the ridiculous spell rather quickly, he'd said. Hermione gulped. "Both," she breathed. Lupin gave another forced, mirthless laugh. "You're the cleverest witch of your age I've ever met, Hermione," he repeated. Hermione shook her head furiously. "I'm not," she snapped. "If I was a little clever, I'd have told everyone what you are," she added. I gasped. "You wouldn't dare," I growled, feeling a rearing monster in my gut. I forced it back down. You wouldn't. You couldn't." "Not again. Please, no. It's been a cycle all my life, endlessly repeating itself. We'd set up a tent on the outskirts of a town, either wizarding or muggle. Those we actually somewhat enjoyed, though Remus got a lot of odd looks. And then, somehow, the secret would get out, and we'd be off again, smarting from the boots of the people hasting to get us out of their town. We thought we could keep it together this time. It wasn't that unusual to be very sickly, right?" "But they already know. At least, the staff do," Remus countered softly, still quite pale, looking as though he was recovering from a physical blow. Ron looked aghast. "Dumbledore hired you, even when he knew you were a werewolf?" he asked incredulously. "Is he mad?"
He's a better man than you, I snapped. I don't know what came over me. I really don't. Ron scowled but made no rebuttal. It seemed I'd struck a nerve. And I told you not to use the W word, I growled hotly, glaring swords. I've moved past the dagger stage, at Ron, who paled beneath my gaze. Rosemary, please, Remus sighed, a bit crossly. He then turned to Ron. Some of the staff thought he was, he answered. He had to work very hard to convince some of the other teachers that I'm trustworthy, he went on. Remus, I said comfortingly. And he was wrong, bellowed Harry suddenly, looking furious. You were helping him the entire time. No, he wasn't, I yelled back, getting in Harry's face. We've already established that I was with him the whole time, and I swear Remus Lupin never... Well, maybe you were just helping Remus help Sirius then, Harry spat. No, I barked back. We've never helped Sirius into the castle. Never! I then spotted Dad collapsing on the bed, covering his face with a shaky hand. Fury billowing hotly in my chest, but it took a few steps back, and I got beside Remus, sensing the story coming, or something. Suddenly, Dad, having had enough of being impatient, was on his feet and over by Remus and I in a blink. Let's kill him already, he roared. Lupin turned to his friend, holding up a finger. Wait, Remus snapped. Dad snapped too. He looked quite suddenly ready to cry. I did my waiting, he screamed. 12 years of it! In Azkaban! Kept away from my own daughter for getting my revenge, he added hoarsely. I gasped, tears brimming in my own eyes. Dad. Once again, I saw precisely what Azkaban did to my father. I see the pain and rage and grief running around behind his sunken eyes, and if I looked close enough, I could almost see the tears brimming. Almost. The other teens looked horrified, though slightly confused, at Dad's outburst, and I was glad to have my face obscured by my unruly, mousy hair as a few tears wound down my face. Remus looked at Dad with something like shock and understanding in his eyes, breathing heavily. The silence was drawn out and tense. Remus looked at the trio for a few seconds, an internal war raging in his mind, before he gripped the handle of his wand, before he grabbed the tip of his wand, offering the handle to Dad. Very well. Kill him. Dad lurched forward, eyes shining brightly with anticipation. But wait just one more moment. Harry and Rosemary have the right to know why, Remus demanded. Dad slumped back, defeated. Remus turned to me. He handed me back the wands, and I stuffed mine into my inner pocket before distributing the rest of them without a word or a glance at my 3 friends. I was still quite angry with them. Then returned to Remus's side. There. You're armed. We're not. Now, will you listen? Wait, Harry growled, holding his wand, bewildered by the turn of events. If you haven't been helping him, he asked venomously, with a glare at Dad, then how did you know he was here? I smirked behind Remus's back, glad to know a lot more than these 3 morons in front of me. Oh, don't give me that look. After they insulted Remus, let's just say I'm none too pleased with their attitudes right now. None at all. Remus had laughter in his eyes as he replied evenly, The map. The Marauders' map. He then chuckled. I was in my office examining it. Here it comes. The story of the Marauders in full detail. I just know it. You know how to work it? Harry asked, flabbergasted. I scoffed. Of course he knows how to work it, I cried, even as Remus said basically the same thing beside me. I helped write it. I'm Moony. That was my friend's nickname for me at school, he said airily, with an almost impatient tone to it. You wrote... Yep, neat, huh? I asked, chuckling, smiling up at Remus. He didn't look quite as amused. The important thing is, he said a bit crossly, I was watching it carefully this evening because I had an idea that you, Ron, Rosemary, and Hermione might try and sneak out of the castle to visit Hagrid before the Hippogriff was executed. And I was right, wasn't I? He then started to pace, clearly agitated, but determined that we should know everything. You may have been wearing your father's old cloak, Harry. How do you know about the cloak? Harry asked suddenly. I jumped slightly, having been paying such rapt attention to Remus's story. Remus waved an impatient hand. Stop interrupting, I hissed, highly impatient and still quite mad at the 3 of them. Remus chuckled reminiscently. Number of times I saw James disappearing under it. That, and Remus naturally knows about the invisibility cloak. You still showed up, though, I muttered, ignoring the incredulous stares I received. Yes, Remus chuckled again. The point is, I watched you cross the grounds and enter Hagrid's hut. 20 minutes later, you left Hagrid and headed toward, the castle. I must say, Rosemary, you did a marvelous job sneaking around without a cloak, Remus added. Fantastic disillusionment charm. I beamed at him despite a flicker of embarrassment. I saw that you were now accompanied by someone else, Remus went on. The trio looked once more thunderstruck. What? Henry asked with a definite anger to it. No, we weren't. Rosemary was not the extra person, Harry, I interrupted. Just listen and it'll all make sense, I pleaded. I really, really wanted to hear the story. I couldn't believe my eyes, Lupin continued, pacing agitatedly. You are now followed by someone who, until quite recently, I believed to be dead. I thought the map must be malfunctioning. How could he be with you? Remus asked rhetorically. I really wish Remus and Dad would just give out the name of the person they intend to murder already. No one was with us, Harry insisted. Harry, I barked. Shut up. Harry looked somewhat affronted, but his jaw clicked shut. And then I saw another dot, moving fast toward you, Remus sighed. Labeled Sirius Black. I saw him collide with you, Rosemary, and then retreat to pounce again. I watched as Sirius dragged two of you into the Whomping Willow. One of us, Ron countered angrily. I growled. No, Ron, Lupin said patiently. Two of you, he said knowingly. Ron, Harry, and Hermione still looked bewildered. Hasn't anyone figured it out? I spat. The trio gave me blank stares. Dad rolled his eyes. It's Peter Pettigrew, he spat. And he's still in this room. Right now. Not helping, I shot before I could think. Dad smiled at me. They don't know about... Do you think I could take a look at your rat? Lupin asked, cutting me off. At those words, Ron clutched tighter than ever to Ron as the rat fought ever harder to get away. Ron looked fiercely up at Remus. Why? What's Scabbers got to do with anything? Everything, Lupin replied, holding out a hand to grab hold of the rat. May I see him? Just give it to him and it'll all make sense, I supplied. Ron shot me a very darkened look. He held Scabbers ever closer to his chest, despite the squeaking and biting and clawing that was starting to make Ron's hands a bloody mess. Suddenly, Scabbers made a break for it, and Ron had to grab his tail and pull him back. From his position on the other side of the bed, on Dad's knee, Crookshanks hissed softly. What? Ron repeated. I scoffed and rolled my eyes. What's wrong? What's Scabbers got to do with... What's my rat got to do with anything? Give it to... I hesitated for a brief second, pretending to nearly trip over a loose board as I took a step forward. Dad, and he'll show you. Dad's eyes flickered at me. I swallowed. I sent him an apologetic gaze, and he nodded, seeming to understand what I was trying to say. But then Dad's eyes strayed to the rat again. A thin, gnarled finger pointed at Peter. That's not a rat, Dad rasped. What do you mean? Of course it's a rat, Ron countered, with the air of stating the obvious. I pinched the ridge of my nose, sighing heavily. What's wrong with you? Ron spat. I glowered at him. Nothing. You lot are just so thick-headed you can't even see what's right in front of you, I replied evenly. My arms crossed over my chest. If you just give Dad, I said, jerking my thumb toward Remus, with another apologetic gaze at Dad, the rat, you'll see what we're talking about. He's not really a rat, Lupin explained evenly, with a cool air. He's a wizard. An animagus by the name of Peter Pettigrew. A tense, ringing silence greeted the words. Finally, the name was out. Alright, so here's where the chapter ends, so I'm going to go get a glass. I'm going to go get a sip of water. I'll be right back. Okay. Alright. The trio looked almost ready to laugh at what I can only assume would have been an absurd statement to them. I rolled my eyes. Oh, come on. Surely you figured it out by now, Hermione, I snapped. Hermione flinched as though it slapped her. Well, not really. I mean, you're mental. All three of you, Ron growled incredulously, glaring hotly at Dad, Remus, and I. Ridiculous, Hermione gasped breathlessly. Harry glared at Dad. Peter Pettigrew's dead, he said. Oh, Merlin, help me not kill these three thick-headed friends of mine. He killed him 12 years ago,
Dad's face twitched fiercely. And yet there was sorrow in his gaze as well. Grief hidden behind fury. Of course. Mum was killed that night, too. Oh, for pity's sake! I cried, running extremely frustrated hands through my hair. For the last time! I meant to, Dad growled behind me. I whirled around. Not really helping your case here, I whispered, though my heart was pounding. Dad grinned at me, as if what he had said was the best news or something, and then dropped it as he glared at Peter again. But little Peter got the better of me. Peter was squeaking harder than ever, desperate to get free of Ron's hands. Not this time, though, Dad yelled, lunging for Peter suddenly. Come out, Peter! Come out and play! Dad screamed in a sing-song voice as he grappled with Ron, who was screaming with pain as Dad's weight descended on his broken leg, for grip on Peter. I ran forwards, all thought driven out in my panic. This could go very wrong. Ron could be seriously injured. Peter might get away. Obviously, I prefer neither happened, if at all avoidable. Dad, no! I screamed, even as Remus cried, Serious, no! So I think my cry was sufficiently disguised. Together, Remus and I managed to get Dad off Ron. Hermione was giving me the same stare she'd given Remus before she let loose his most terrible secret. Uh-oh. Wait! You can't just do it like that, Remus panted, reminding me of his present situation. We've got to explain. We can explain afterwards, Dad screeched back. Remus and I pushed him back again. Dad was still remarkably strong for having recently escaped Azkaban. One of Dad's thin, wasted hands clawed the air as it fought to grab Peter. That filth is the reason I couldn't watch my own daughter grow up, he bellowed fiercely. I gasped. Hermione flinched. Wait, she breathed in a tiny, hardly audible little voice. No. I gulped. They've got a right to know everything, Remus roared, panting heavily as he fought against Dad. Ron's kept him as a pet. There are parts of it even I don't understand. And Harry, you owe Harry and Rosemary the truth, Sirius, Remus added in an only slightly calmer tone. Dad stopped. Then, with a huge effort, he heaved a great sigh. All right, then, he growled. Tell them whatever you like, but make it quick, Remus. I want to commit the murder I was imprisoned for. I flinched. This really was not the best way to start this, was it? You're nutters, both of you, Ron accused sharply. And you're dragging Rosemary along with you. Oi, shut your trap and listen, I growled. Ron, however, stood up. And I'm not being dragged along with these two, I added. And I'm not mental. None of us are. I've had enough of this, Ron yelled, apparently not having heard me. I'm off. I started to panic. Ron was leaving, taking Peter with him. Lupin, however, was quite on top of things. He flicked his wand at Peter, and Ron halted, thinking Lupin was threatening him. You're going to hear me out, Ron, he ordered. Just keep a tight hold on Peter while you listen. He's not Peter, he's Scabbers, Ron yelled angrily, but moved back toward the bed nonetheless, trying to put his rat back in his pocket. But Peter was getting more and more desperate. Ron swayed when Peter gave an especially violent lurch, overbalanced, and if it hadn't been for Harry, he would have fallen to the ground. However, Harry caught his friend and gently pushed him back onto the bed. Then Harry turned to gaze fixedly at Lupin. There were witnesses who saw Pettigrew die, he said evenly. A whole street full of them. I blanched. Dad's eyes narrowed. They didn't see what they thought they saw, he growled. Remus took it up then, as Dad seemed incapable of speech all of a sudden. Everyone thought Sirius killed Peter. Isn't that obvious? I believed it myself until tonight because the Marauder's map never lies. Peter's alive. Ron's holding him, Harry. Harry looked unconvinced. He glanced down at Ron, and they shared a look that quite clearly said, They're mental. Hermione seemed to agree with Ron and Harry, but was a little more vocal. But, Professor Lupin, she reasoned with a would-be calm manner, Scabbers can't be Pettigrew. It just can't be true. You know it can't. I scoffed and rolled my eyes as Remus chuckled. Why can't it be true? He asked, as if Hermione had simply encountered a problem with Grindylows in class.
Hermione looked shocked, like she couldn't believe no one else knew something so obvious. I rolled my eyes, but refrained from huffing in annoyance. Barely. Welcome to my world, girlfriend. Enjoy. Because people would know if Peter had been an animagus. We did animagi in class with Professor McGonagall, and I looked him up when we did homework. The Ministry of Magic keeps tabs on witches and wizards who can become animals. There's just a register showing what animal they become and their markings and things. And I went and looked Professor McGonagall up on the register, and there have only been 7 animagi this century, and Pettigrew's name wasn't on the list. She stopped abruptly when I started laughing out loud. It was just so amusing to me that Hermione, upholder of the law, could not fathom the idea of unregistered animagi, refused to even consider the possibility of it. Harry and Ron looked at each other like, I'm so confused, and yet, why am I not surprised? Before Lupin started to laugh as well. Right again, Hermione, he said. But the Ministry never knew that there used to be 4 unregistered animagi running around Hogwarts. Once again it was like thunder had struck the room. The sudden silence was ringing with unasked questions. Then Dad spoke up. If you're going to tell them the story, get a move on, Remus, Dad muttered. I've waited 12 years. I'm not going to wait much longer. All right, but you'll need to help me, Sirius. I only know how it began, Remus replied. He might have begun the story right then, but was cut off by the bedroom door opening. We all stared, perplexed at the door, and Remus even went and checked it out. There was no one there. No one. So why do I feel like there's someone right where Lupin's staring? Why do I feel an unseen pair of eyes, searching the room, taking everything in? No one there, Remus reported, walking back to us. This place is haunted, Ron cried, sounding scared. I chuckled. Nope. What? Ron asked, looking and sounding as though he'd been struck. Remus cleared his throat. It's not. The Shreiking shack was never haunted, Remus explained, with a distracted edge to it as he stared at the door, puzzled. The screams and howls the villagers used to hear were made by me. He seemed to gather himself for a moment, pushing his prematurely graying hair out of his face. He gave a sigh. That's where this all starts, with my becoming a werewolf. None of this could have happened if I hadn't been bitten, and if I hadn't been so foolhardy. You can't blame yourself, Remus, I said automatically, meaning every word. Remus sent me a clear, shut it look, and I chewed my lip. Ron made to speak. Shh! Hermione and I cried at once. Lupin nodded toward us gratefully. I was a very small boy when I received the bite. My parents tried everything, but in those days there was no cure. The potion that Professor Snape, Dad perked up at the mention of his old nemesis, has been making for me is a very recent discovery. It makes me safe, you see. As long as I take it in the week preceding the full moon, I keep my mind when I transform. I'm able to curl up in my office, a harmless little wolf, with Rosemary for company. Remus gave me a fond look, and Dad raised his eyebrows at me like, Wow, really? That's awesome. Thanks. It meant a lot, coming from Dad himself. And wait for the moon to wane again. Poor Rosemary was always extra tired afterwards, but she never left my side. Coffee, I think, was never consumed in such quantities before Rosemary came along. That's why Rosemary always gets a cup of coffee in the mornings, Hermione gasped. I nodded, then pressed a finger to my lips for silence. The others sent me looks of begrudging respect. Remus went on. Before the wolfsbane potion was discovered, however, I became a fully fledged monster once a month. It seemed impossible that I'd be able to come to Hogwarts. Other parents weren't likely to want their children exposed to me. But then Dumbledore became headmaster, and he was sympathetic. He said that, as long as we took certain precautions, there was no reason I shouldn't come to school. Lupin then sighed and turned to Harry. I told you, months ago, that the Whomping Willow was planted the year I came to Hogwarts. The truth is, it was planted because I came to Hogwarts. This house... Remus broke off to stare about the room miserably. I was struck with the desire to hug him, but I knew it wasn't the time or the place. That and Remus didn't feel like he needed it. Plus, it would just make things more awkward than they already were. The tunnel that leads to it, they were all built for my use. Once a month, I was smuggled out of the castle, into this place to transform. The tree was placed at the tunnel mouth to stop anyone coming across me while I was dangerous. Remus said with a grimace. I chewed my lip, knowing all too well what it must have been like. I've seen so many transformations, heard so many howls and screams of pain so intense that I started crying, trying to block out the noise with my hands over my ears, that I had an idea what it was like. No one spoke. The only sound, apart from Lupin, was Peter's vigorous squeaking. Remus swallowed thickly. My transformations in those days were terrible. It is very painful to transform into a werewolf. I was separated from humans. He said the word like it was something he couldn't ever be. Remus and I sent him sympathetic glances. To bite, so I bit and scratched myself instead. Giving him those lovely scars of his, I mused, eyes trained on Remus's face. He'd always told me that they were unknown, that he couldn't remember how exactly he'd got them. I suppose it's a mercy he doesn't remember actually doing it to himself. Remus gave me I might be generally long-suffering here, but shut up look. The villagers heard the noises and the screaming and thought that they were hearing particularly violent spirits. Dumbledore encouraged the rumor. Even now, when the house has been silent for years, the villagers don't dare approach it. Remus gave a shudder, then grinned a little. But apart from my transformations, I was happier than I'd ever been in my life. For the first time ever, I had friends. 4 great friends. Sirius and Jenny Black. Dad smiled at Remus, but there was a hint of sadness about it. Peter Pettigrew. And, of course, your father, Harry. James Potter. Now, my 4 friends could hardly fail to notice that it disappeared once a month. I made up all kinds of stories. I told them that my mother was ill and that I had to go home to see her. Dad grinned reminiscently. I was terrified that they would desert me the moment I found out what I was. But of course, they, like you, Hermione, worked out the truth. Dad sent Remus a look like, you and I both know that's not true, complete with a knowing grin. Remus rolled his eyes. He knew as well as we did that he was a terrible liar. And they didn't desert me at all. There's a surprise, I muttered sarcastically. Remus rolled his eyes. Instead, they did something for me that would make my transformations not only bearable, but the best times of my life. Remus chuckled in a reminiscent way. They became animagi. Harry looked befuddled. My dad, too? He asked. Dad rolled his eyes. I chuckled. No duh, Harry. He was one of Dad's best friends. Both my dads, I thought with a grin. Yes, indeed, both of you. It took them the better part of 3 years to figure out how to do it. I grinned suspiciously. My eyebrows rose, silently pondering how normal people would do it, and Remus caught my look. Don't go and look it up now, Rosemary, he said sternly. I frowned as Remus turned back to Harry. Your father and Sirius here were the clever students in the school. And lucky they were, because the animagus transformation can go horribly wrong. One reason the ministry keeps a close watch on those attempting to do it. Peter needed all the help he could get from James and Sirius. Finally, in our 5th year, they managed it. They could each turn into a different animal at will. Hermione tilted her head, an adorably confused look on her face. But how did that help you? She asked. Think about it, I coaxed, amused more than irritated now. Remus chuckled. They couldn't keep me company as a human, so they kept me company as animals. A werewolf is only a danger to people, Remus explained to the trio's confused looks. Then his eyes flicked to me knowingly. I glanced at the floor, biting my lip. They sneaked me out of the castle every month under James's invisibility cloak. They transformed. Peter, as the smallest, could slip under the willow's attacking branches and touch the knot that freezes it. They would then slip up the tunnel and join me. Under their influence, I became less dangerous. My body was still wolfish, but my mind seemed to become less so while I was with them. A surge of adoration for the marauders, aside from Peter, that is, came over me. They had agreed to take a huge risk, with the possibility of dying in the process, to help someone they'd only met about a year ago. I wondered when Mom came in. Was she there from the start? Did she hang around the marauders even then? Dad seemed suddenly quite impatient. Hurry up, Remus, he barked. Pun fully intended. Remus, however, gazed calmly at his friend. I'm getting there, Sirius. I'm getting there. Well, highly exciting possibilities were open to us now that we could all transform.
Soon we were leaving the shack and roaming the school grounds in the village by night. Sirius, Jenny, and James transformed into such large animals they were able to keep his werewolf in check. No easy feat, I muttered under my breath. Dad sent me a "I know" look. Remus looked at me apologetically. I doubt whether any Hogwarts student ever found out more about the Hogwarts grounds in Hogsmeade than we did. And that's how he came to write the Marauder's map and sign it with our nicknames. Sirius is Padfoot, Jenny was Wolfpad, Peter is Wormtail, and James was Prongs. Harry blanched. What sort of animal? Harry started, but Hermione interrupted, looking a bit cross. That was still really dangerous. Running around in the dark with a werewolf? I growled at the W word, but held my tongue. What if you'd given the others the slip and bitten somebody? Hermione! I barked. Lupin sighed heavily. A thought that still haunts me, he said, voice heavily remorseful. And there were near misses, many of them. We laughed about them afterwards, especially when Jenny joined the team. She was quite a laugh, though she was one of the near misses. Lupin ran a hand through his hair, his voice hardening and taking a tone of self-loathing. One of the closer ones, even. We were young, thoughtless, carried away by our own cleverness. We heaved a great sigh. Sometimes I felt guilty about betraying Dumbledore's trust, of course. He had admitted me when no other headmaster would have done so, and he had no idea that I was breaking the rules he had set down for my own and others' safety. He never knew that I'd led 3 fellow students into becoming animagi illegally. But I always managed to forget my guilty feelings every time we sat down to plan our next month's adventure. And I haven't changed, he sighed heavily. He then gave a bitter chuckle that held no humor whatsoever in it. All this year I've been battling with myself, wondering whether I should tell Dumbledore that Sirius was an animagus. But I didn't do it. Why? He asked rhetorically. I grimaced, remembering all the times I'd caught Remus, pacing in his office agitatedly, only to plaster a smile on his face when I entered. There were quite a few times. Dad, don't, I said. Please. Whatever he's going to say, it'll just be more proof of his martyr complex. Remus took a deep breath. Because I was too cowardly. My head snapped up. How could Remus say that? He's definitely not a coward. He's one of the bravest people I know, taking the hits the world is dishing out without complaining. How can he call himself a coward? It would have meant admitting that I'd betrayed his trust while I was at school, admitting that I'd led others along with me. And Dumbledore's trust has meant everything to me. He let me into Hogwarts as a boy, and he gave me a job when I'd been shunned all my adult life. Hadn't you been shunned about before that, too? I thought idly, still too wrapped up in listening to even get into vocalizing my snarky comment. Unable to find paid work because of what I am. Besides small jobs in Muggle towns and cities, when we were especially desperate. Remus sighed heavily. Dad looked sympathetic. And so I convinced myself that Sirius was getting into the school using dark arts he'd learned from Voldemort, that being an animagus had nothing to do with it. So, in a way, Snape's been right about me all along. I knew what he meant. Most of the time he was forcing thoughts of those days from his mind. I see the way he suddenly shakes his head when he thinks I'm not watching him at night. From beside me, Dad tenses at Lord Voldemort's name, or just the fact that Remus was insinuating that Dad was a Death Eater, which would never happen. No, he... Snape? Asked Dad, cutting me off. What's Snape got to do with it? I sighed, preparing to tell him, but Remus beat me to it. He's here, Sirius. He's teaching here as well. Remus then gazed at the trio. Professor Snape is at school with us. He fought very hard against my appointment to the Defense Against the Dark Arts job. No shock there, Dad and I muttered together. We grinned at each other. Remus had always said I was blessed with my father's personality. Oddly enough, it was always with a sarcastic tone to his voice. Remus sent us an exasperated look. He's been telling Dumbledore all year that I'm not to be trusted. He has his reasons, Remus went on, when he saw the furious look on my face. I'd been getting more and more worked up all year about how Snape treats my godfather, and how he took every opportunity to throw my father down as well. You see, Sirius here played a trick on him which nearly killed him. A trick that involved me. Here Dad made a derisive snort, startling Sirius and making him pause. Serves him right, sneaking around, trying to find out what we were up to, hoping he could get us expelled. Wait, what did he do exactly? I asked. Remus hadn't been liberal with the details, even after I'd found out about the lycanthropy. Remus sighed. Severus was very interested in where I went every month. We were in the same year, you know, and we, didn't like each other very much. He especially hated James. Jealous, I think, of James' talent on the Quidditch pitch. I snorted. Bloody likely. You and I both know the way James hit on— Rosemary, please! Remus snapped. Suddenly feeling guilty, I sank back into silence. Remus sent me a warning glance before turning back to the others. Anyway, Snape had seen me crossing the grounds with Madame Pomfrey one evening as she led me toward the Whomping Willow to transform. Sirius thought it would be amusing to tell Snape that all he had to do was prod the knot on the trunk of the tree with a long stick, and then he'd be able to get in after me. I sent my dad a disbelieving stare. He could have killed Snape, and he thought it would have been amusing? They must have really hated each other. Dad looked slightly abashed. You didn't, I whispered, ignoring the looks I was getting from the trio now. Dad looked me in the eyes slowly. Remus never said I didn't regret it later. I hummed, reserving judgment until I had heard everything. Well, of course Snape had to try it. How desperate was Snape to get rid of the Marauders? Jeez. If he'd got as far as the house, he would have run into a fully grown werewolf. But your father, Harry, and Jenny, who'd heard what Sirius had done, went after Snape and pulled him back, at great risk to their own lives. And Jenny wasn't even an official Marauder yet. She was just a friend of ours, an acquaintance at that point. She'd just heard what had happened and charged along with James. She, as well as Snape, glimpsed me at the end of the tunnel, though. Jenny felt pity for me, while Snape sneered and avoided me from then on. He is forbidden to tell anyone, but from that, they were forbidden to tell anyone, but from that time on, they knew what I was. So that's why Snape doesn't like you, me and Harry chorused slowly. He thought you were in on the joke, Harry asked. It really wasn't a joke, Harry, I said admonishingly, with a reproving glare at Dad. He looked ever more abashed, mumbling something like, tried to apologize, but Snivellus wouldn't hear it, under his breath. And with my sharpened hearing, a benefit of transforming so many times to my other form, along with subtly pointed ears. Not that anyone's noticed. I heard. Suddenly my ears detected the whooshing of a cloak, and then, even as I spun around to look at the door, it seemed like the air itself revealed Professor Snape himself. He was pulling off Harry's invisibility cloak, his wand at the ready, pointed directly at Lupin, who flinched back. That's right, Snape sneered. Oh, vengeance is sweet. Sorry, chapter ended. Okay. Hermione screamed with shock, and Dad shot to his feet. Hermione and Ron looked thunderstruck. I ended up in front of everyone, eyes glaring at Snape, whose wand hadn't moved, and was now pointed at me. At least until Remus pulled me backward behind him. How I hoped I'd be the one to find you, Snape continued. He held up the cloak. I found this at the base of the Whomping Willow. Very useful, Potter. I thank you, he said, panting slightly. He looked as if he'd just run a race, as he was quite smug-looking. You wondering, perhaps, how I knew you were here? He asked Remus, who made no move to reply. I've just been to your office, Lupin. You forgot to take your potion tonight, so I took a goblet full along. And very lucky I did. He tilted his head, looking quite insane. Lucky for me, I mean. Lying on your desk was a certain map. One glance at it told me all I needed to know. I saw you running along this passageway and out of sight. By now, Dad had come forward. Snape had then pressed his wand to Dad's throat when he got too close. I squeaked, unable to help it. Remus then took a few steps forward while the trio sent me befuddled looks I never really registered. Snape flicked the wand toward Remus, and I was still moving forward, only Remus's arm holding me back. Severus, I told the headmaster again and again that you two were helping Remus's old friend into the castle. And here's the proof, Snape continued, glaring daggers at us. And Dumbledore saw right through your stupid blind hatred. Quiet! Remus and Dad hissed at once, and I shut my jaw. Snape jeered at me before turning back to Dad, who still had Snape's wand pointed at his throat. Only my worry for my dad's safety stayed me. I knew that if I rushed Snape, it would all go very south very fast. But that didn't stop me from glaring at Snape with the most hatred possible. Not even I dreamed that you would have the nerve to use this old place as your hideout. He wasn't, I blurted pleadingly. I had to make Snape see sense before he does something rash and irreversible. Severus, you're making a mistake, Lupin pleaded, a desperate, urgent tone to his voice. You haven't heard everything. I can explain. Sirius isn't here to kill Harry. 2 more for Azkaban tonight, Snape interrupted. You wouldn't, I yelled, heart thudding wildly, feeling as though I had been struck by lightning. Not even you could be so— Silence, Snape roared, and I felt my jaw slam unwillingly shut. I shall be interested to see how Dumbledore takes this. He is quite convinced that you were harmless with Rosemary to keep you in place, you know, Lupin. Snape jeered. Don't bring her into this, Dad roared, but as he wasn't in the position to do anything, he couldn't do more than talk and threaten. He viewed you as a tame werewolf, Remus blanched, and I felt a coil of hot red anger twist in my gut. It was getting harder and harder to stand there, when my dad's life was threatened, and Remus was being taunted. Remus just shook his head. You fool, he said softly. He can't help it. It's habit by now, Dad sneered. Once again, he's put his keen and penetrating mind to the task, and, as usual, come to the wrong conclusion. Quiet, Sirius, Remus said admonishingly. Be quiet yourself, Remus, Dad snapped back. Look at you two, bickering like an old married couple, Snape jeered. Why don't you run along and play with your chemistry set? Dad snapped. I let out a bark of laughter. 12 years and Dad still got the sass he was famous, or infamous for, depending on your point of view, in school. Remus turned to Snape. Think about this, Severus, he said quietly, pleadingly. Is it a schoolboy grudge worth putting an innocent man back in Azkaban, knowing what he never got to finish, as there was a sound like thunder, and thin, snake-like cords lashed out, and all of a sudden I felt myself being pushed aside, and then I was on the ground, Remus before me, bound and gagged, unable to move. Horror and rage filled me with a reckless abandon, and I tore at Snape. Another bang, and I was in Remus's position. I cried out, the sound strangely muffled, as my head connected hard with the floor. Light blinded me for a moment, then spots danced. Dad screamed out in rage and lurching forward. I was trying to protest, but my voice wasn't working through the gag. How dare you! Dad roared, hands flying toward Snape's throat. Snape merely pressed the wand harder into his throat. Thankfully, Dad had the sense to stop. Give me a reason. I beg you. Snape's voice was cold and venomous, and it was impossible to tell if it was Snape or Dad that glared with more hatred. Silence pervaded, tense and electric with anger and rage. The trio were glancing at one another, lost and confused. I bucked and struggled against the cords, which were so tight they were starting to cut into my skin. It didn't work. Snape flicked his wand for a split second at me, then the cords tightened. I flinched and remained still. Remus was resigned, eyes closed as he lay still on the floor. Hermione was panting as if she had just run all the way here, as she took a hesitant step towards Snape. Professor Snape, it wouldn't hurt to hear what they've got to say, would it? Snape turned baleful, glittering eyes on Hermione, who flinched back slightly. Miss Granger, you are already facing suspension from this school. He then flicked his eyes at all of us. You, Potter, Black, I flinched. Of all the scenarios I'd planned to reveal the truth, this was the last one I would have picked. I let out a groan, and Remus sagged further into the ground. If I could, I would have bit my lip. I knew Remus wanted me to avoid all the baggage he'd been dragged down by for all his life. The trio didn't seem to register the impact of Snape's words as he continued. And Weasley are all out of bounds, in the company of a convicted murderer and a werewolf. For once in your life, hold your tongue! Hermione took another step forward. But if there was a mistake,
Keep quiet, you stupid girl, Snape roared, cutting her off coldly. She flinched back. Don't talk about what you don't understand. I flinched against the cords, again as a few sparks nearly caught Dad's hair on fire. Oh, vengeance is sweet, Dad repeated, sneering at Dad. He had that annoyingly smug look on his face again. How I hoped I'd be the one to catch you, Snape said, once more. This guy was seriously creeping me out here. The joke's on you again, Severus, Dad spat, his teeth bared in a snarl. Then his gaze softened as he gazed around at me on the floor, at Remus, who hadn't moved since he had fallen, and finally to Harry's confused and bewildered expression. He bit his lip and swallowed. As long as this boy brings his rat up to the castle, he croaked, nodding toward Ron, and you at least release Rosemary, I'll come quietly. My eyes widened, and I shook my head as vehemently as possible. Dad couldn't turn himself in. Doesn't he realize that Snape's only interested in the kiss being performed on Dad? Getting him back from that sick prank for so long ago? Dad sent me a sad look that spoke volumes. He knew what would happen. No, please, Dad. Snape's eyes narrowed. Up to the castle, Snape repeated, voice as cool and smooth as silk. I don't think we need to go that far. All I have to do is call the Dementors once we're out of the willow. They'll be very pleased to see you, Black. Pleased enough to give you a little kiss, I dare say, he cackled. I again felt lightning strike me, and I felt numbed, cold, and clammy all over. Snape couldn't do that. Even if he hates my dad's guts. He just couldn't. Couldn't he? I mean, he's not that evil. Even Snape, who seems to hate everything and everyone, can't possibly be so narrow-minded, so full of long-suffering hatred for an immature prank, that he would condemn a man to an eternity of a blank, mindless existence? One can only imagine what it must be like to endure. It's said to be nearly unbearable to witness, but I'll do my best. Snape jibed cruelly, sticking Dad even harder than ever with his wand. I kicked out against the cords, but Snape merely tightened them again, causing Dad to flinch toward him before the wand pressed itself back into his throat. What little color Dad's face left it at the determined look on Snape's face. Dad's eyes flicked to me again. I gave him a subtle flick of my head. You've got to hear me out. The rat. Look at the rat. He stopped abruptly when he saw no change in Snape's eyes. If anything, they hardened even more. Come on, all of you, Snape said icily. With a snap of his fingers, the end of the cords that bound Remus and I extended to Snape's hands. I'll drag the werewolf and levitate the pup, he said, with a nasty grin at me and a glare at Dad. I narrowed my eyes, glaring at him with as much hatred as I could convey, and then some. I said I'll come quietly. No running or trying to escape. If you, at the very least, let Rosemary go, you get, Dad spat. Perhaps the Dementors will have a kiss for Remus as well, Snape continued idly. For the first time, Remus kicked against his bindings, merely making them tighter. His eyes widened in fear. If it was possible, I glared with more hatred than ever at Snape. Okay. Hi. Okay, Dad, I can sort of understand. But Remus? What has Remus ever done to Snape? How could Snape even think of handing my father over to the Dementors? It was sickening. Snape's ruining two innocent lives who've already gone through so much, not to mention leaving me essentially an orphan, before seeming to remember, just because of some stupid prank? This is bloody ridiculous. I then grimaced as Snape started dragging me over the floor, my skull hitting the ground again painfully, before he seemed to remember what he'd said, and indeed levitated me. By my ankle. I floated helplessly toward the door, fuming and silently uttering 1,000 curse words that would have sent me to the bathroom to have my mouth washed out inwardly. And then, Harry was blocking the door. He seemed confused by his own actions, but unwilling to back down. Snape glared at him furiously. His eyes made him look quite insane, and with the cords in his hands, and with two bodies being dragged along behind him, He looked like some psychotic villain in those Muggle horror movies Remus enjoys taking me to whenever he could afford it. "Get out of the way, Potter. You're in enough trouble already," Snape growled, teeth bared. Dad was still glaring with a murderous fire at Snape, but he did take one step toward the door. Snape's smug grin was quite frightening. "If I hadn't been here to save your skin," I moaned against the rag. Is he seriously lording his daring rescue over Harry like this? Harry looked just a bit mad. Professor Lupin could have killed me about 1,000 times this year. Rosemary, too. I've been alone with either of them loads of times, having defense lessons against the Dementors, and hanging out in the common room, cramming homework. If they were helping Black, why didn't they just finish me off then?" Snape rolled his eyes with the nastily superior air. "Don't ask me to fathom how a werewolf and a mindless pup's minds work," he said icily. My eyes were now slits of ice, yet burning with white-hot hatred. Dad growled, but by now knew better than to try anything. "Get out of the way, Potter," he said again, and when Harry made no move to let Snape pass. I felt gratitude for Harry amidst the rage and fury. Behind us, Hermione and Ron looked bewildered, but Hermione was helping Ron stand, slipping around under Ron's shoulder. Harry himself looked about as furious as me. "You're pathetic!" Harry screamed. "Just because I made a fool out of you at school, you won't even listen to—" "Silence! I will not be spoken to like that!" Snape roared furiously. His eyes blazed, and he looked more maniacal than ever. I was honestly quite frightened of him right now. How could he be this way? How could he be so narrow-minded on revenge for that stupid prank for so many years? Oh no. Wait. Doesn't he think... Oh, Merlin. Crap. He thinks Dad's the reason Lily's gone. He never knew about the last-minute switch of secret keepers. But then, any tiny, small, minuscule amount of sympathy I may have felt towards Snape vanished, as the horrid, smug look on his face returned in full force. "Like father, like son, Potter. I have just saved your neck. You should be thanking me on bended knee," he went on, the light of madness in his eyes. "Bloody likely. You have no idea how freaking annoying and irritating you are right now," I thought waspishly. My eyes narrowed again. "You would have been well served if he'd killed you. You would have died like your father, too arrogant to believe you might have been mistaken in Black. Now get out of the way, or I'll make you," he growled. Harry refused to move, and the respect for him increased in me. "Get out of the way, Potter!" Snape screeched. He seemed even more insane, if that's possible. Harry seemed suddenly resolute, and his wand seemed to apparate directly into his hand. And then the next instant there were 3 voices screaming, and a bright flash of light, and pain blinded me for a moment as I crashed to the floor. Snape's spell breaking as he flew into the wall, knocking down another bed's posts as he did so, causing it to collapse. Strangely, the ropes remained tightly bound around me, even after Snape was out cold. However, they seemed to be loosening, painstakingly slow. I kicked and thrashed against the bonds again, eyes blazing with determination. I was gonna get out of these bonds, so help me. Dad was bending over me, but not taking his eyes off Harry. He seemed upset, and I really can't blame him. "You shouldn't have done that, Harry. You should have just left him to me." "Yeah, we've got a score to settle with him," I said, as Dad cut the ropes quickly and gently held me to my feet. I swayed a little, but regained feeling all over my body with an unpleasant, crawling, tingling sensation all over. I massaged particularly sore areas, throat being a nasty one, my jaw as well, looking from Dad to Harry and to the other 2 behind me. "Easy there, Rosie," Dad muttered. I grinned and at long last hugged my dad. Harry looked very much like he'd been slapped. Harry and Hermione Ron looked very much like he'd been slapped. Harry and Hermione had realization written across their faces. "Wait," I chuckled nervously, rubbing the back of my neck. "Surprise!" I smiled. "You see—" "I knew it!" Hermione shrieked suddenly. I started to suspect when you accidentally called Remus by his name rather than Dad a bit ago. And then, when Remus lunged for Scabbers, you yelled, Dad, no. And it wouldn't make sense if you were talking to Lupin. She trailed off. And now, we attacked a teacher. Oh, we're going to be in so much trouble. Hermione, I sighed. Is that really all you can think of right now? I say let's just get up to the castle, figure it out from there. The reason I was saying this was so that Remus can get the Wolfsbane potion in him before the moon rises. Something had reminded me about what night it was. I'm not sure what. I sent Remus a pointed look, and he registered what I was trying to say. He bucked and struggled, and Dad bent down to untie him. And Remus stood up abruptly, swaying slightly as he rubbed the circulation back into his limbs. Thank you, Harry, he said, nodding his head. I smiled and hugged Remus. Hold on, Ron said, looking at me oddly. You're Black's kid? I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose and shaking my bowed head. Yes, Ron. Remus and I agreed it would be best if no one knew. Sorry, Dad, I muttered sheepishly. Dad smiled, and I hugged him again. No offense taken. I was just worried that both of you, Harry and Rosie, he said, nodding at me and Harry. Well, that you hated me, wanted me dead. It's nice to be proven wrong in this instance. Oh, I'm still not saying I believe you, Harry said flatly, giving me this is not over look, tearing his eyes away to look at Lupin. Come on, Harry, I huffed. You can't seriously still... I'm not saying I still think he's guilty necessarily. I'm just reserving judgment, he huffed back. I stuck my tongue at him, but smiled as well, glad to have made some sort of tiny amount of progress. What? Remus looked resolute. Then it's time we offered you some proof. He turned to Ron. You, boy, give me Peter, please, now, he said, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Ron blanched, clutching his rat ever closer to his chest, despite its struggling. Come off it, he said in a slightly scared, weak voice. Are you trying to say he broke out of Azkaban just to get at Scabbers? You three cannot still believe Dad's guilty, I growled. Ron looked uncertainly at Harry and Hermione for support. I mean, okay, say Pettigrew could turn into a rat. There are millions of rats. How's he supposed to know which one he's after he was locked up in Azkaban? I opened my mouth to reply, but then stopped short, leaving my upraised finger to just fall back and my jaw to shut. I then turned to Dad, sending him a questioning glance. You know, Sirius, that's a fair question, Remus mused, a slight frown on his face. How did you know where he was? Dad smirked and thrust a hand into his robes, drawing out a slightly faded, crumpled cutout from the Daily Prophet. It showed the Weasley family in front of a pyramid, waving at the camera. I then noticed that Scabbers was on Ron's shoulders. I gasped, realization dawning. That's why he'd been stalking about the school. Breaking in? Whoa. That's also how he knew which rat it was. The one with the redheaded kid always running after it. That, and he just knows it's Peter, I guess. Remus looked bewildered. How did you get this? Fudge. I raised an eyebrow. Fudge gave Dad a paper? When he came to inspect Azkaban last year, he gave me his paper. And there was Peter on the front page, on this boy's shoulder. I knew him at once. How many times have I seen him transform? And the caption said the boy would be going back to Hogwarts, to where Harry and Rosemary were. Remus glanced at me and Harry subconsciously. Great Scott, he muttered, taking the picture and staring between it and the real rat in Ron's hands. His front paw. I immediately glanced at it and found a toe missing. It had been like that ever since I'd known Ron and the others. Ron frowned. What about it? Dad rolled his eyes. He's missing a toe, isn't he? Lupin had another I've just had an enormous epiphany look. Of course. So simple. So brilliant. He cut it off himself? Dad nodded. Just before he transformed, Dad explained. When I cornered him, he yelled for the whole street to hear that I betrayed Lily and James. And then, before I could curse him, he blew apart the whole street with the wand behind his back. He killed everyone within 20 feet of himself, including including Jenny, God rest her soul, and sped off down to the sewer with the other rats. Dad looked somber and weighed down again. Scabbers has been in my family for... Ron began, glaring at Lupin and Dad. 12 years, Dad interrupted, suddenly hot and tempered. Curiously long life for a common garden rat. Ron looked very similar to a cornered animal. Look, Scabbers probably got into a fight with another rat or something. Didn't you ever wonder why he was living so long? Remus asked calmly. We've been taking good care of him, Ron replied. Didn't anyone tell you, Ron? Said Remus kindly, but then Harry took over, looking stunned. All they could find of Pettigrew was his finger, Dad finished. The dirty coward cut it off so everyone would think he was dead. Scabbers isn't looking too good at the moment, though, is he? Remus mused snarkily. And there's a certain snideness to the tone. I'd guess he's been losing weight ever since he heard Sirius was on the loose again. He's been scared of that mad cat, Ron roared. Dad smirked. That cat isn't mad, Dad whispered, making his voice sound more hoarse. He reached out and stroked Crookshank's round, fluffy head. He is the most intelligent of his kind I've ever met. He recognized Peter for what he was right away, and when he met me, he knew I was no dog. It was a while before he trusted me. Finally, I managed to communicate to him what I was after, and he's been helping me. Hermione looked both flabbergasted and insulted. What do you mean? She asked, looking scandalized and edging subconsciously away from the cat. He tried to bring Peter to me, but couldn't, so he stole the passwords into Gryffindor Tower for me. As I understand it, he took them from a boy's bedside table. But Peter got wind of what was going on and ran for it. This cat, Crookshanks did you call him, told me that Peter had left blood on the sheets. I suppose he bit himself. Well, faking his death had worked once. Harry seemed to snap out of it all of a sudden, and he abruptly turned angry. And why did he fake his own death? Harry? Because he knew you were about to kill him like you killed my parents. Harry! I tried again. Don't you dare! Dad never laid a hand on your parents. Haven't you been listening? Remus stayed anything else I was going to add with a calming hand on my shoulder. And now you've come to finish him off, Dad roared fiercely. It was as though he hadn't even heard me. Remus turned a patient eye toward Harry. He opened his mouth, but Dad spoke up, eyes glittering evilly at Peter, who gave a violent jerk, but Ron managed to hold on tightly. Yes, Dad growled, suddenly sounding quite intimidating. Harry then looked even more furious. Then I should have let Snape have you, he spat. No, Harry, it wasn't him. Someone did betray your parents. That's what we've been trying to tell you, Remus said, with an urgent, hurried tone to it. Harry, don't you see? All this time we've thought Sirius betrayed your parents and that Peter tracked him down. But it was the other way around, don't you see? Peter betrayed your mother and father. Sirius tracked Peter down. And Harry cut Remus off with a very furious look. That's not true. He was their secret keeper. He said so before you turned up. Harry, he only said he didn't... Harry, I as good as killed them, Dad interrupted miserably. Gazing with such sorrow at Harry, I felt my heart ache to hug Dad. As it was, I went over to him and laid a hand on his shoulder for moral support. I persuaded Lily and James to switch to Peter at the last minute. Persuaded them to use him as secret keeper instead of me. I'm to blame, I know it. The night they died, Jenny and I had arranged to check on Peter, make sure he was still safe. But when we arrived at his hiding place, he'd gone. Yet there was no sign of a struggle. It just didn't feel right. I was scared. Jenny was worried for Pettigrew, as usual thinking only of others' safety. We set out for your parents' house straight away. And when I saw their house destroyed and their bodies, Jenny and I realized what Peter must have done. What I'd done. Dad nodded, not looking up. Dad finished. There was a break in his voice. His head bowed, cocked at an angle so we couldn't see any part of his face. And if I fancied a guess, that's what he's been reliving with the Dementors for 12 years or so. Dad nodded, not looking up. I gasped softly, sympathy and love nearly overwhelming me. I sat down next to Dad, my hand still on his shoulder. His hand went over to my back to rest against my waist. Enough of this, Remus ordered crisply, his voice steely and cold. It was the voice he used when he was talking about Dad before now. It was the voice he used when he was ordering me to stop talking about the Marauders, to stop asking questions. There's one certain way to prove what really happened. Ron, give me that rat, he ordered, sounding as if he wanted to prove it to himself as well as the rest of us. What are you going to do with him if I give it to you? Force him to reveal himself. If he's really a rat, it won't hurt him. It won't, even if he is Peter, I added. Ron took one look at Remus's face, which had only hardened, hesitated for the briefest second, then held out Peter at long last. I must admit, I was really excited about this. Finally, the truth was out. Harry and I now knew the whole story, and we were about to see the proof that Dad and Remus were, in fact, quite sane and being quite honest. Whether or not Harry and the others believed the truth remained unclear, but I knew that I'd believed Sirius from the first moment he mentioned Mum. Even before that, ever since I heard about Dad. And then right now, every time Mum's name was mentioned, remorse, grief, and self-loathing filled his eyes. Every time his voice carried the emotions his sunken eyes betrayed. That haunted look was enough, should have been enough, to make anyone believe that he was telling the truth. Anyone, apparently, but the thick-headed trio. I was then drawn out of my thoughts because Scabbers was thrashing around wildly in Ron's hands. His beady eyes were bulging out of his head in fear. Oh, and Remus's hands. Ready, Sirius? Remus asked as Dad neared him. By the time Remus had finished speaking, Dad was by the second bed, grabbing Snape's wand from the floor where it had fallen. He was back now, eyes shining with determination, hatred for Peter burning in his face. Together? Dad asked. Remus smiled. I think so, he said softly, holding Peter at arm's length and looking as though Peter was something unclean and unpleasant. Oh, wait. He is. On the count of 3, I slid up to join them, though I didn't really even know what the spell was. I was just eager to make Harry and the others see the truth that I've been searching for nearly my whole life. Before I could ask what the spell was, though, it had already been cast, and there was a blinding flash of blue-white light, and Scabbers was struggling harder than ever in mid-air, for a few seconds before crashing to the ground, where there was another flash of light. And the second or two it took for everyone's eyes to readjust to the low light after the flashes, Pettigrew had indeed been forced to reveal himself. He was bolder and thinner than the man in the photos I had seen, wilder too. And there was more of a ratness to him. His buck teeth were more pronounced, his eyes beady and a bit smaller. His nose looked unnaturally like a snout now. His breathing was very fast and shallow. He was cringing madly and wringing his hands convulsively. Crookshanks took one look at the sniveling man before us and started hissing violently, the hairs on the back of his back standing on end. Peter's shifty eyes repeatedly found the door, as well as constantly eyeing the few windows. Remus smiled in a would-be warm manner with which one greets old friends, but this time is clearly forced, as was the politeness in his tone. Well, hello, Peter. Long time no see. Something in Lupin's tone and/or eyes, as well as the slightly intimidating figure of Dad, bade Pettigrew take a chance and throw caution to the wind as he dove for the door. But as Dad and Remus stood in front of it, he was quickly repelled. Being a step behind them, I was left to take a step back to avoid his hands, which were out in front of him. Peter gazed around wildly before fully eyeing Dad and Remus. Serious? Remus? It was amazing how rodent-like Peter's voice was. My friends! My old friends! Then, as his eyes flicked around the room, his gaze rested on me and he seemed ready to speak. Dad's arm rose defensively, and a low growl emanated from his throat. Remus pushed his arm back down and turned to Peter again with that fake friendly smile. We've been having a little chat, Peter, about the night Lily and James died. You might have missed a few of the finer points while you were squeaking around down there on the bed. Made it hard to hear Remus, really, I growled, so low it was hardly audible. Peter then took a closer look at Remus, and his eyes widened. Remus, you don't believe him, do you? Peter gasped, sweat beading on his face, sounding quite shocked and terrified. As he should. He tried to kill me, Remus, he whined, and I was struck with the desire to kick him. He was pathetic, groveling about like that, making pathetic claims and stuttering terribly. So we've heard, Remus spat, releasing more control over his voice, letting more of the ice pervade it. I'd like to clear up one or two little matters with you, Peter, if you'd be so— He's come to try and kill me again, Peter interrupted squeakily, pointing at Dad with his severed hand, having to use his middle finger. He killed Lily and James, and now he's come to kill me too. You've got to help me, Remus. Oh, get a hold of yourself, Peter, I spat venomously. Remus laid a hand on my shoulder. I hadn't realized I was reaching for my wand and stalking toward the now cowering man before me. I blinked and backed up, pointedly ignoring the slightly horrified look on the trio's face. No one's gonna try and kill you. We're not, I whined. Remus glared at me and I huffed. Until we've sorted a few things out, Remus finished. Peter looked even wilder, frantically looking about between the angry people in front of him and the door behind us and back again several times a minute. Sorted things out? Repeated Peter fearfully. I knew he'd come after me. I knew he'd be back for me. I've been waiting for this for 12 years. I narrowed my eyes at him. Really? I growled sarcastically. You knew Sirius was going to break out of Azkaban? When nobody has ever done it before? Remus asked coolly. He's got dark powers the rest of us can only dream of. Oh, for the love of— I growled, but Peter continued his shrill little rant, without apparently even acknowledging me. How else did he get out of there? I suppose he who must not be named taught him a few tricks. Don't you dare talk about my father like that, I seethed, fists clenched and ready to strangle this no-good son of a ghoul. Voldemort? Teach me tricks? Dad seethed. You say it too? I asked, impressed. Peter looked like he'd been threatened with a whip, curling and cowering on the floor. Remus and I do, I mused, grinning. Dad turned to Pettigrew, who had yet to uncurl. What, scared of hearing your old master's name? Dad mused snidely. Probably, I mused, arms crossing and glaring at Peter in much the same manner as I'd glared at Snape earlier. Dad grinned at me before turning and resuming his furious expression. I don't blame you, Peter. His lot aren't very happy with you, are they? Peter's face whitened. I grinned wickedly at him. It was a grin Remus described as Dad's "it's prank time" look. Peter cowered back, sweat dripping from his snout-like nose and upper lip. Don't know what you mean, Sirius. He was breathing faster than ever now. You haven't been hiding from me for 12 years, Dad seethed. You've been hiding from Voldemort's old supporters. I heard things in Azkaban, Peter, he rasped, grinning evilly at Peter. I blinked. Was Dad purposely making Peter wet himself? Or is he just so used to being taunted and spat upon in prison that he's now used to dealing taunts out in return? Is this second nature to him after 12 years in that terrible place? I found I didn't want to know. Not really. They all think you're dead, or you'd have to answer to them. I heard them screaming all sorts of things in their sleep. Sounds like they think the double-cross or double-crossed them. Voldemort went to the Potters on your information, and Voldemort met his downfall there. And not all Voldemort's supporters ended up in Azkaban, did they? Dad, I breathed. This was getting out of hand. Enough. Dad sent me a "don't interfere" look. I gasped softly, withdrawing the hand I'd been stretching out. But Dad had already turned it back to Peter. There are plenty of them still out there, biding their time, pretending they've seen the error of their ways. If they ever got wind you were alive, Peter— Don't know what you're talking about, Pettigrew repeated, sounding more shrill than ever. It was clear that he was beginning to panic. He wiped his face on his sleeve and turned to Remus, whose eyes were still ice cold. "You don't believe this madness, Remus?" But Remus had heard enough. He glared at Peter harshly. "I must admit, Peter, I have difficulty in understanding why an innocent man would want to spend 12 years as a rat," he said evenly yet waspishly. Peter seemed to latch on to Remus's words like a lifeline, seeming to gleam some fragment of hope for mercy out of them. "Innocent, but scared," he squeaked desperately. "If Voldemort's supporters were after me, it was because I put one of their best men into Azkaban. The spy, Sirius Black." "Quit talking about him like that," I roared. Peter flinched away, and I realized 2 things all of a sudden. 1, that I was inches from Peter's face, and 2, that my wand was in my hand and sparking. I shoved my wand back into my pocket and took a few steps away from Pettigrew. And he had the sudden nerve to shove me away. Being used to having to stand my ground against a raging werewolf, this sorry excuse for a man hardly made me move an inch. I used the momentum to get me away before I could hex his face off, though. Dad came forward, eyes twitching. "How dare you even touch her?" he seethed, and I could see the dog in him as he spoke. "Or even look at her! And I, a spy for Voldemort? When did I ever sneak around people who were stronger and more powerful than myself? But you, Peter, I'll never understand why I didn't see that you were the spy from the start. You always liked big friends who'd look after you, didn't you? It used to be us. Jenny, me, Sirius, Remus, and James." Peter's white face was glistening in the ever-decreasing light as he wiped it again. He was now panting with the intensity of his breathing. "Me? A spy? Must be out of your mind. Don't know how you can say such a—" "Lily and James only made you Sacred Keeper because I suggested it," Dad hissed waspishly. Pettigrew took a step back, cowering again. "I thought it was the perfect plan. A bluff. Voldemort would be sure to come after me. Would never dream that they'd use a weak, powerless thing like you. It must have been the proudest moment of your miserable life, telling Voldemort that you could hand him the Potters." Peter, white and clammy as wet marble, was wringing his hands when he wasn't wiping his face, muttering distractedly things like, "Never would have thought. How can he say such a far-fetched?" and Isn't this an absolute lunacy to even begin to think?" Hermione looked pensive. "Professor Lupin, can I say something?" Remus only turned his head to look at her. "Certainly, Hermione," he replied graciously. "Well, this man, he's been sleeping in Harry's dormitory for 3 years. If he's been working for you-know-who, how come he never tried to hurt Harry before now?" I turned thunderstruck to Hermione. "I don't believe it." "Whose side are you on?" I yelled. Peter was getting used to my outbursts, apparently. And took a step to my right to look at Hermione. "There! Thank you! Don't you see, Remus? I have never heard a hair on Harry's head. Why would I?" he shrieked, his voice even squeakier and higher in pitch. Dad growled. "I'll tell you why. Because you never did anything for anyone unless you could see what was in it for you. Voldemort's been hiding for 15 years. They say he's half dead. You weren't about to commit murder right under Dumbledore's nose. For a wreck of a wizard who lost all his power, were you? You'd want to be sure he was the biggest bully on the playground before you went back to him, wouldn't you? Why else did you find a wizard family to take you in? Keeping an ear out for news, weren't you, Peter? Just in case your old protector regained strength and it was safe to rejoin him." I smirked evilly. Peter was well and truly panicking inwardly now. I could see it in his face. And I'm perfectly aware I'm being somewhat cruel, but I can't help but take a little bit of pleasure in Peter's expression. "What? He messed my life up majorly. But don't tell Remus I said that. Although I've been perfectly happy with Remus, I do have literal scars from living with him. Not that I mind. And I want to see Peter get some sick justice before I'm through with him." Peter's mouth was opening and shutting repeatedly. He looked like an obese fish after a workout. Hermione took a shaky step forward. She seemed ready to faint. Mr. Black, serious?" she asked in a tiny, hesitant little voice. I chuckled under my breath, hiding it with a purposefully sloppy cough. Dad jumped at the title, Mr. Black. He was, I suppose, used to hearing that name only when people were talking about his father, who wasn't quite Dad of the Year from what I've heard. Nevertheless, he nodded. "If you don't mind my asking," she continued, with the air of tiptoeing around a sleeping giant, How did you get out of Azkaban, if you didn't use dark magic?" Pettigrew seemed to think these words helped him, and I suppose they might be helping a little bit, but... "Hermione," I groaned, "pick a freaking side, would you?" She merely sent me a confused look. "Sorry, it just... Thank you," Peter breathed, as if Hermione had just saved his life. "Precisely, exactly, what I..." Lupin silenced him with a fierce glare. It seemed that the merest flicker of the wolf ghost across his face. I chewed my lip. We needed to get to the castle. Get that potion. Dad was facing Hermione, the same pensive look I had. Otherwise I could have been taken as annoyance, but I knew it wasn't. "I don't know how I did it," he said softly. "I think the only reason I never lost my mind is that I knew I was innocent. That wasn't a happy thought, so the Dementors couldn't suck it out of me, but it kept me sane and knowing who I am. It helped me keep my powers, so when it all became..." He gave me a glance. "Too much, I could transform in my cell, become a dog. Dementors can't see, you know." Dad swallowed. It was obvious this wasn't pleasant for him, having to talk about his darkest moments in the worst place on earth in front of me, when I knew hardly anything about him, beyond whatever Remus had told me and what I'd seen of him. He heaved a sigh. "They feel their way toward people by feeding off their emotions. They could tell that my feelings were less human when I was a dog. But they thought, of course, that I was just losing my mind like everyone else in there, so it didn't trouble them. But I was weak. Very weak." Here, Dad's eyes glazed over a little, a haunted, faraway look in his eyes as he spoke of his troubles. I felt for him, truly. And I had no hope of driving them away from me without a wand. But then I saw Peter in that picture. I realized that he was at Hogwarts with Harry. And Rosie, though she was still under Remus's careful eye. Dad steadily shook his head as if to clear it. Peter was perfectly positioned to act, if one hint reached his ears that the dark side was gathering strength again. Dad's voice was getting stronger and more bitter towards the man on the floor, wordlessly mouthing what must have been rebuttals, no doubt. Ready to strike at the moment he could be sure of allies, and to deliver the last Potter to them. If he gave them Harry, who dare say he betrayed Lord Voldemort? He'd be welcomed back with honors. He heaved another sigh. So you see, I had to do something. I was the only one who knew Peter was still alive. And a dangerous psychopath, I added darkly. Dad nodded. It was as if someone had lit a fire in my head, and the Dementors couldn't destroy it. It wasn't a happy feeling. It was an obsession, but it gave me strength. It cleared my mind. So one night, when they opened my door to bring food, I slipped past them as a dog. It's so much harder for them to sense animal emotions when they're confused. I was thin, very thin. Thin enough to slip through the bars. I swam as a dog back to the mainland. I journeyed north and slipped into the Hogwarts grounds as a dog. I've been living in the forest ever since. Except when I came to watch the Quidditch course. You fly as well as your father did. And Rosie, you looked so much like your mother did. It was amazing to watch. Believe me, Harry, I never betrayed James and Lily. I would have died before I betrayed them. He bowed his head, and I could hear a thick swallow. His eyes were wet as he looked earnestly into Harry's eyes and then mine. I gazed at Harry, and found belief in his eyes. I heaved a relieved sigh. Now all we had to do was convince the other two. Harry nodded, to mute looks of horror from Ron and Hermione, who had been staring dumbstruck at the scene unfolding before them. Peter's eyes nearly burst out of his head. "No!" he squeaked, falling to his knees and groveling toward Dad, his hands pleadingly clasped in front of him, as if in prayer. "Sirius, it's me. It's Peter. Your friend. You wouldn't..." "There's enough filth on my robes without you touching them," Dad growled, and made to kick at Peter, who recoiled and made toward Remus. Remus, you don't believe this? Wouldn't Sirius have told you they'd changed the plan? Remus's eyes flashed with realization and comprehension. He turned to Dad, who seemed to understand what Remus had just realized. Not if he thought I was the spy, Peter. His voice was calm and even, almost nonchalant, but his voice betrayed the hurt and slight betrayal he was feeling. It was one of the things you learned to pick up when living with Remus. I assume that's why you didn't tell me, Sirius? He asked over Peter's shining, trembling head. Dad heaved a great sigh. His eyes swam with remorse, self-loathing, and a desperate begging for forgiveness. And although I felt a flicker of anger at my father for daring to suspect his old friend, I saw how torn up he was, and knew that he didn't need any more punishment. Especially not from me, his daughter, whom Dad was convinced hated him. I wanted to show him, prove to him that I didn't hate him at all. "Forgive me, Remus," was all he said. It seemed all he could say. Remus smiled that same smile that told me, always, even after a particularly nasty row about Dad, that he still loved me, that he would always forgive me. I smiled, overjoyed that Remus finally let go of the bitterness he'd held on to toward my dad for all these years. I guess it's weird to say that I'm proud of my godfather, but I really am. Remus smiled graciously, forgivingly, and warmly at his friend. Not at all, Padfoot, old friend. And will you, in turn, forgive me for believing that you were the spy? For arguing so hotly with Rosemary because of it? Dad didn't look surprised at this at all. He merely smiled at me, and it was that smile that Remus gave me when I mastered something he was teaching me. It was a proud smile. Of course. Shall we kill him together? Dad asked almost casually, as if asking if they should merely engage in some kind of prank, not end a life. My face drained of its blood. Yes, I think so, Remus replied in the same grim tone. It frightened me. I knew Peter deserved it, but this is madness. Peter is the proof of my dad's innocence, and if we kill him, Dad'll be even more guilty, and even Remus would get arrested. Dad and Remus can't just kill somebody, can they? I know they hate his guts, but this is overkill. Way overkill. You won't, Peter gasped. He then scrambled around to face me, and I immediately scooted away, taking him back by the scumbag in front of me is seriously going to try and gain my favor. My wand flicked almost lazily into my hand, and I pointed it at the sniveling man before me. Don't waste your breath, I growled, hate suddenly flooding me. Much as I hate the idea of Peter being ruthlessly killed, I can't just let him get away with his betrayal. You're the reason my father and I never knew each other. I swallowed. Now I think about it, I can't help but remember all the times in my naive childhood that I'd called Remus Daddy, meaning it, never knowing that it was just a false title. How would it have been different with Dad beside me, with Remus and Mum laughing at my failures and coaching me toward success? You're the reason my dad is now on the brink of madness. I then gulped, a heavy lump forming quickly in the base of my throat. And you killed my mother. I blinked the tears away, hating the breaks in my voice, as well as the trembling in it. Peter's eyes widened at my blazing look, my sparking wand inches from his nose. So don't expect any pity or mercy from me, I spat, meaning every word. I was by no means going to be party to murder, and I hate the thought that my godfather and father were this close to actually doing it. But he needs to be locked away somewhere he can never get out again. He deserves what my father went through. Azkaban. Not death, surely. Peter's eyes went even wider if possible. He then turned to Ron. He seemed to think that the fact that he had hidden for 12 years, masquerading as a pet, counted for something. His mistake. Ron, haven't I been a good friend? A good pet? You won't let them kill me, Ron, will you? You're on my side, aren't you? Oh, shut up! I spat, growling fiercely at the pathetic excuse for Gryffindor. For a man. Now that I've revisited all the ways in which Peter had screwed up my life, I was getting more and more worked up, and more understanding of Remus and Dad's predicament. They quite possibly hate Peter more than I do. Dad was Mum's lover, his best friend, the one who stayed by him through thick and thin, though Remus hinted that she was also the one to try to get rid of the suspicion of Remus being the spy and Dad, to no avail. But she still stayed by her husband, even unto death, like a wife should, like a true Gryffindor would. And quite suddenly, I felt like crying. Mom, how would it have been different if she raised me? If Dad hadn't gone after Pettigrew in rage? If... But it did no good to dwell in the dreams and what-ifs of life. I let you sleep in my bed, Ron said, as if not quite believing it himself, snapping me from my reverie. He was glaring hotly at Peter, and I knew in that moment that Ron believed the truth about Dad. It was difficult to tell if Hermione did too. She still looked kind of indecisive. Peter lit up, like the words that Ron had said had been a lifeline, as if there were nothing in the boy's tone to suggest that he hated him. It seemed that only the words mattered to him, not the way in which Ron had said them. Kind boy, kind master, you won't let them do it. I was your rat. I was a good pet. Oh, good grief, I growled. Are you for real right now? Dad sniffed idly. If you made a better rat than a human, it's not much to boast about, Peter. Dad spat harshly, voice laden with menace and hatred. Ron wrenched his leg away from Peter, face paling with even more pain. Peter turned, looking even more desperate, to Hermione. I let my jaw hang slack. He was seriously reduced to this? Groveling around, hoping somebody will stick up for him? Sweet girl. Clever girl. And apparently he's not also above cheap flattery to keep his neck. You won't let them help me. He was in such a panic, I then realized, that he was doing anything that came to his mind, no matter how stupid it may seem. Hermione pulled her robes out of Ron's clutching hands and backed away toward the wall. And then Peter did something that I never would have thought him desperate enough to try. He turned to Harry. Harry, you look just like your father. Just like him. Oh. Wrong move, little man. Wrong move. Dad's eyes twitched. That was always a sign of imminent danger in me. And if I really am Dad's daughter in this respect... How dare you speak to Harry? How dare you face him? How dare you talk about James in front of him? Dad screeched. Peter dived even further into dangerous waters as he continued talking to Harry, who was looking more and more revolted again, groveling harder than ever. Harry, James wouldn't have wanted me killed. James would have understood, Harry. If he was mental, I groaned lowly. Peter didn't seem to register my interruption. He would have shown me mercy, he cried, as Dad, Remus, and I grabbed a hold of Peter's robes and threw him forcefully onto the ground, where he sniveled and cowered away from the 3 wands. There was no way I would not participate, but no way I could kill Pettigrew. Pointed right at him, twitching in terror. You sold James and Lily to Voldemort, and you murdered my wife, along with 12 or more others. Do you deny it? Dad spat, shaking in fury and nearly uncontrolled rage. It seemed too much for Peter, who burst into tears as he lay there on the ground. It reminded me of a badly behaved baby throwing a tantrum. Sirius! What could I have done? He whined, adding to the mental baby picture. The Dark Lord! I growled, my eyes narrowing. That was how the Death Eaters referred to Voldemort. So, is Peter really that stupid? Or is he just that used to calling Voldemort that name? You have no idea. He has weapons you can't imagine. I was scared, Sirius. I was never brave like you and Jenny and Remus and James. I never meant for it to happen. He who must not be named forced me." "Merlin's beard!" I cried, scoffing at the pathetic excuse. If Peter had a loyal bone in his body for his friends, he could have stood up to Voldemort and never joined him at all. "Don't lie! You've been passing information to him for a year before Lily and James died. You were his spy!" Dad roared, shaking in a terrible fury. Peter blanched, quaking on the floor. He was taking over everywhere," he pleaded, which only really served to make us hate him more. What was there to be gained by refusing him?" Oh my heavens, this guy was literally just begging for Azkaban right now. Practically throwing himself in, really. Dad's eye twitched again. "What was there to be gained by fighting the most evil wizard who has ever existed?" Dad spat venomously. "Only innocent lives, Peter." "But feel free to join them anyway," I scoffed sarcastically. "I hear they've got nice jackets." Okay, I know that was a little weak and incredibly lame, but I was getting more and more worked up here, and my mind was surrendering to the fury within. Peter acted like a big, balding baby again, crying and sniveling on the floor. "You don't understand," he whimpered. "He would have killed me, Sirius." "What would it have mattered, as long as your only friends were safe?" I asked slowly, my fists shaking with the effort of not punching him. "Then you should have died! You should have died rather than betray your friends, as we would have done for you!" I found myself agreeing with Dad there. Peter never should have been in Gryffindor. He would have fit right in Slytherin. All of them too weak to resist the alleged allure of the dark arts. At least, most of them. Some of them aren't that bad. Like Scotty. But for the most part, they're evil, sniveling little wretches. Nevertheless, Dad's tone sent an icy shiver down my spine. This was wrong. We can't just kill somebody. Even if he deserves nothing less. Dad and Remus should be brave enough, wise enough, strong enough to let Peter be taken to Azkaban, which is arguably worse than death. However, I was still next to Dad and Remus, shoulder to shoulder with them, and their wands raised themselves, pointing at Peter. I blanched. This was it. But could I really just sit here and let my father and godfather commit murder? Especially when it would only mean getting Dad into an even worse position? Not to mention where we would leave Remus. And Azkaban as well. That's what settled it for me. The furious red mist cleared from my eyes. I can't remember when it actually started. And I knew Mum wouldn't want Pettigrew to be slaughtered by her husband and best friend. Even she would agree that he should go to Azkaban, but never outright just slaughtered. Nobody but the lowest, meanest examples of human existence deserved that. "You should have realized that if Voldemort didn't kill you, we would," Remus said softly, and that chilled me more than Dad's angry rant. "Goodbye, Peter," he said, and in that instant, I knew I wasn't standing for this anymore. I stood my wand and shoved myself beside Harry, surprisingly, in front of Dad and Remus, facing the wands. Now came the moment of truth. What would Dad and Remus do? I held my breath as the seconds lengthened. Dad's face seemed to wilt, and Remus looked slapped. "No!" Harry bellowed, arms out to the side protectively. "You can't kill him! You can't! Please, just think about this," I begged, feeling as out of breath somehow as Harry sounded. Mum wouldn't want this, even if he deserves nothing less," I said, and Dad's wand arm lowered a few subtle inches, only seconds before Remus's. There were several moments of tense, ringing silence, and then, "Harry, this piece of vermin is the reason you have no parents. This cringing piece of filth would have seen you die too, without turning a hair," Dad snarled, his eyes never leaving Peter, who was breathing heavily in relief. "You hurt him. His own stinking skin meant more to him than your whole family, than my wife, his best friend." I swallowed, seeing the grief well hidden behind the rage in my father's eyes. Even so, I refused to budge. "He's the reason I couldn't raise you, Rosie, like I should have." "I know," Harry and I replied. We'll take him up to the castle. Much as I hate to say it, he doesn't deserve to die, I added. You know that, Dad. You're better than this. Bless you, children. Bless you, Peter breathed, looking ready to sob again with relief. He crawled toward Harry, who snarled at him and withdrew his foot before Peter could grab it. Get off, he spat, and for a split second it looked like Harry was going to kick Peter. Not that I blame him for wanting to, but then didn't, choosing to merely glare at him harshly. I said we'd take you to the castle, he started, apparently not noticing Dad's look of betrayal. After that, the Dementors can have you. Peter continued grumbling, full throttle at once. Harry, thank you. It's more than I deserve. Thank you. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I don't reckon my dad would have wanted them to become killers. Just for you, Harry snarled. As one, Remus and Dad lowered their wands, and Peter clutched his chest, looking faint with relief. Oh, but he never said we wouldn't give you an actual reason to cry before we give you over to them, I said, grinning wickedly. After all, as long as you're alive, the Dementors can always give you a little kiss, I went on. I see now why Dad taunts him like this. It's kind of fun, especially when Peter shrank down in terror. Dad gave me a smile before turning to Harry. You're the only one who has a right to decide, Harry. But think about what he did. I grimaced. I didn't need reminding. It was right in front of me, in the form of a wasted man, reduced to nothing but thoughts of revenge. Revenge and fury towards his one-time friend. That would always be there. The reminder of what Azkaban had done to him. This wasted, haunted look about my father would never, ever go away, even after he's regained the lost weight that makes him look so eerie and skeletal. Harry almost looked disgusted with himself, but resolute at the same time. He can go to Azkaban, Harry repeated. If anybody deserves that place, he does. Peter was shaking in terror again. Lupin looked resigned. Very well. Stand aside, you two. We didn't. After everything the two men had said and nearly done, could Remus really blame us? The look he gave us was enough to tell us that he understood. I'm going to tie him up. That's all, I swear, he said, and the look in his eyes, I finally believed him. Apparently Harry trusted my judgment on Remus, and backed away seconds after me. Sure enough, in a matter of seconds, Peter was gagged and bound at Remus's feet, shaking and moaning in terror. He kicked and bucked against the cords, but they only grew tighter. I wondered if Remus was subconsciously doing this, or if that was just the way the spell worked. Dad also looked resigned, but still resolute. But if you transform, Peter, we will kill you. You agree, Harry? Harry glared down at the figure below him, and nodded in clear view of Pettigrew. Lupin nodded tersely, quite suddenly businesslike and cold. Right. Ron, I can't mend bones nearly as well as Madame Pomfrey, so I think it's best if we just strap your leg up until we can get you to the hospital wing. He then hurried over to Ron, who I was pleased to see didn't flinch away, but stayed firmly where he was as Remus drew his wand and pointed at the broken leg, muttering, Ferula! Bandages sprang up Ron's leg, and a splint appeared out of nowhere, and soon Ron's leg was expertly wrapped. Ron gratefully accepted Remus's offer of a hand up, and he tested his leg, grimacing only slightly. That's better. Thanks, he beamed at Remus. Hermione, I had just noticed, had been gazing fixedly at Snape for several minutes, hardly seeming to notice anything else. What about Snape? She asked timidly, in a worried little voice. What about him? I retorted. Leave him be. He can find his own way back. I added darkly, glaring at Snape. Lupin, already checking on the unconscious professor, chuckled. Down, girl, he said under his breath, and even with my sharpened hearing I had trouble picking it up. He's checked Snape's pulse and straightened up. There's nothing seriously wrong with him. You were just a little overenthusiastic. He's still out cold. Perhaps it would be best if we don't revive him until we're safely back in the castle. We can take him like this, he said, drawing his wand again and pointing it at Snape. Mobile corpus! And Snape was lifted slowly into the air, much as I'd been levitated myself, but by his wrist, neck, and knees instead. Remus then tucked the invisibility cloak into his jacket pocket. Dad sniffed coldly, glaring down at the still trembling Peter beside him. "And 2 of us should be chained to this," he said contemptuously, nudging Peter hard with his toe. "Just to make sure." I was about to volunteer when Remus beat me to it. "I'll do it." "And me," Ron added. I mock glared at Ron half-heartedly. I wanted to be the one who enforces me and Harry's decision, as childish as that is. Too fascinated by Dad's conjuring of a pair of handy monocles, and busy trying not to think of where they had come from to give the matter my full attention. Peter was chained up in a matter of seconds. Ron glared, highly affronted at Pettigrew. It seemed as though he had taken the revelation of Peter's true identity as a personal insult. Crookshanks seemed jubilant as he leapt off the bed and led the way out of the shack, his tail swaying jeerily. Getting into the tunnel was tricky, to put it mildly. Remus, Ron, and Peter had to squeeze into the tunnel sideways, and I was right after them. Snape and Dad came after me, with Harry and Hermione directly behind them. There was a fairly heavy silence. "You know what this means, you two?" Dad asked abruptly after a few moments. "Turning Pettigrew in?" "Yeah," I said. "You're free," Harry and I chorused together. Dad looked like he was steeling himself up for something. He turned to Harry. "Yes, but I'm also... I don't know if anyone ever told you. I'm your godfather." "Yeah, I knew that." "How?" I asked interestedly. Harry didn't reply. I looked over his shoulder and caught a glimpse of slightly peaked cheeks. And Dad's smirk. He seemed to sense, as well as I did, that however Harry had found out, it was illegal. "Well, your parents appointed me your guardian, just as I appointed Remus as Rosemary's. So if anything happened to them..." He paused, as if really wanting to say something, but knowing it wouldn't be met well. If he was going to say what I think he was going to say, Harry would love to. I would too. I'll understand, of course, if Rosie, you want to stay with Remus and Harry with your aunt and uncle. But, well, think about it. Dad was seriously... He couldn't think we wouldn't want to. Oh, Merlin, yes! Of course Remus will have to visit. Every day he's able. Me and Dad will be a team, helping Remus through his transformations, and Harry might even become an Animagi as well. Help us help Remus, and oh, it'll be so much fun. Once my name's cleared, if you wanted a different home... Oh, Merlin, yes! I squeaked, feeling ready to explode with giddiness, and then felt a little guilty as Remus's shoulders slumped slightly. "Remus, you can come too. I know that lighthouse is getting a little shabby and cramped for you. Dad'll have some big, lovely house, and..." Harry finally seemed to process what was going on. What Dad had just said. I was shaking, giddy with excitement. Ron and Hermione were strangely quiet, not saying a word as they trudged and wobbled along the tunnel. They seemed to understand that this was a family matter. Sort of. "What? Live with you?" Harry asked incredulously, as if he couldn't believe his ears. However, Dad looked crestfallen. His head hit a bit of overhanging stone, painfully, but it seemed he hardly noticed. If only Dad turned around. "Of course, I thought you wouldn't want to, Harry. I understand, I just thought I'd..." "Dad," I muttered, voice shaking with suppressed laughter. He still hadn't seen Harry's almost disbelieving, shocked face. It was priceless. "Are you insane?" Harry asked after a moment. His voice was shaky and raspy and hoarse. It was as shaky, raspy, and hoarse as Dad's. He swallowed. "Of course I want to leave the Dursleys," he squeaked. "Have you got a house? When can I move in?" As the impact of Harry's words hit Dad, he slowly turned to look at him, seeing the earnest and wide-eyed look on Harry's face. "You want to? You mean it?" He looked taken aback. I suppose he hasn't heard what the Dursleys are like. If he had, he wouldn't doubt that Harry would want to leave. But still, it's a little worrying. Dad gave a little laugh. Harry gave a little laugh. "Yeah, I mean it," Harry said excitedly. And Dad smiled. Really smiled, for the first time I'd seen him. It made such a huge difference. For the first time I could see the remnants of the man who was laughing in James and Lily's wedding photos. He laughed for a minute or two, and his arm wrapped around my shoulders as he seemed to be laughing too hard to fully support himself. I suppose that's natural after 12 years in Azkaban. I supported Dad as he walked, and reached out to lower Snape a little before he was scalped against the rocks. As it was, he'd have a nasty headache and a few minor injuries. I could see dark red splotches sprouting up from his hair, and smelled faint traces of blood. Once Dad had recovered from his merriment, he turned to Ron, who seemed to be limping again. Guilt flickered across Dad's eyes. "Sorry about the bite. I reckon that twinges a bit," he said. Ron glared at Dad. "A bit? A bit?" he asked a bit harshly. "You nearly tore my leg off!" Dad smirked. "I was going for the rat," he said with a nasty look at Pettigrew. He seemed to quiver under Dad's fierce gaze. "Normally I have a very sweet disposition as a dog." "So that's where I get it," I mused. "Probably a bit from Mom, too." "In fact, more than once James suggested that they make the change permanent," he said. "The tail I could live with, but the fleas? They're murder." I nodded, remembering with a subtle shiver every time how many times I'd gotten those dreadful little things. Itchy as all get out. Poor Remus had to deal with them while I struggled around on the floor, as I was helplessly trying to scratch them off. He would calmly mutter the spells and incantations to rid me of the terrible insects, while I flailed about, driven nearly mad with the itching sensation all over me. Fleas were much worse in human form, let me tell you. Harry and I chuckled a little at the joke, and then we came to the end of the tunnel. And that's pretty much it. So, yeah, if you haven't read the rest of the story, I guess this won't really make a whole lot of sense, but, yeah, so, for those of you who don't know, Rosemary is actually Sirius's daughter, and, she's Remus's goddaughter, and the whole year she's been lying to people, saying that she's Remus's daughter, and that, anyway, because, Remus was like, I don't want her to be as affected, by prejudice and stuff like I was, so I'm just gonna ask her to not, even subject herself to that at all, and just avoid it. So, yeah. And so you might want to read the rest of the story so this will make sense. Sorry, kind of but anyway, love you guys.